give me your pocket change. I accept coins and shiny things. All manner of goods.
Gordon Edgley's sudden death came as a shock to everyone, not least himself. One moment he was in his study, 7 words into the 25th sentence of the final chapter of his new book, "And the darkness reigned upon them," and the next he was dead. A tragic loss. His mind echoed numbly as he slipped away. The funeral was attended by family and acquaintances, but not many friends. Gordon hadn't been a well-liked figure in the publishing world, for although the books he wrote, tales of horror and magic and wonder, regularly reared their heads in the bestseller lists, he had the disquieting habit of insulting people without realizing it, then laughing at their shock. It was at Gordon's funeral, however, that Stephanie Edgley first caught sight of the gentleman in the tan overcoat. He was standing under the shade of a large tree, away from the crowd, the coat buttoned up all the way despite the warmth of the afternoon. A scarf was wrapped around the lower half of his face, and even from her position on the far side of the grave, Stephanie could make out the wild and frizzy hair that escaped from the wide-brimmed hat he wore low over his gigantic sunglasses. She watched him, intrigued by his appearance. And then, like he knew he was being observed, he turned and walked back through the rows of headstones and disappeared from sight. After the service, Stephanie and her parents travelled back to her dead uncle's house, over a humped-backed bridge and along a narrow road that carved its way through thick woodland. The gates were heavy and grand and stood open, welcoming them into the estate. The grounds were vast, and the old house itself was ridiculously big. There was an extra door in the living room, a door disguised as a bookcase, and when she was younger, Stephanie liked to think that no one else knew about this door, not even Gordon himself. It was a secret passageway, like in the stories she'd read, and she'd make up adventures about haunted houses and smuggled treasure. This secret passageway would always be her escape route, and the imaginary villains in these adventures would be dumbfounded by her sudden and mysterious disappearance. But now this door, this secret passageway, stood open, and there was a steady stream of people through it, and she was saddened that this little piece of magic had been taken from her. Tea was served, and drinks were poured, and little sandwiches were passed around on silver trays, and Stephanie watched the mourners casually appraise their surroundings. The major topic of hushed conversation was the will. Gordon wasn't a man who inspired or even demonstrated any great affection, so no one could predict who would inherit his substantial fortune. Stephanie could see the greed seep into the watery eyes of her father's other brother, a horrible little man called Fergus, as he nodded sadly and spoke somberly and pocketed the silverware when he thought no one was looking. Fergus's wife was a thoroughly dislikable, sharp-featured woman named Beryl. She drifted through the crowd, deep in unconvincing grief, prying for gossip and digging for scandal. Her daughters did their best to ignore Stephanie. Carol and Crystal were twins, 15 years old, and as sour and vindictive as their parents. Whereas Stephanie was dark-haired, tall, slim and strong, they were bottle blonde, stumpy, and dressed in clothes that made them bulge in all the wrong places. Apart from their brown eyes, no one would guess that the twins were related to her. She liked that. It was the only thing about them she liked. She left them to their petty glares and snide whispers, and went for a walk. The corridors of her uncle's house were long and lined with paintings. The floor beneath Stephanie's feet was wooden, polished to a gleam, and the house smelled of age, not musty exactly, but experienced. These walls and these floors had seen a lot in their time, and Stephanie was nothing but a faint whisper to them. Here one instant, gone the next. Gordon had been a good uncle. Arrogant and irresponsible, yes, but also childish and enormous fun, with a light in his eyes, a glint of mischief. When everyone else was taking him seriously, Stephanie was privy to the winks and the nods and the half-smiles that he would shoot her way when they weren't looking. Even as a child, she felt she understood him better than most. She liked his intelligence and his wit, and the way he didn't care what people thought of him. He'd been a good uncle to have. He taught her a lot. She knew that her mother and Gordon had briefly dated. Courted, her mother had called it, but when Gordon had introduced her to his younger brother, it was love at first sight. Gordon liked to grumble that he had never got more than a peck on the cheek, but he had stepped aside graciously, and had quite happily gone on to have numerous torrid affairs with numerous beautiful women. He used to say that it had almost been a fair trade, but that he suspected he had lost out. Stephanie climbed the staircase, pushed open the door to Gordon's study and stepped inside. The walls were filled with the framed covers from his bestsellers and shared space with all manner of awards. One entire wall was made up of shelves jammed with books. There were biographies and historical novels and science texts and psychology tomes, and there were battered little paperbacks stuck in between. A lower shelf had magazines, literary reviews and quarterlies. Stephanie passed the shelves which housed the first editions of Gordon's novels and approached the desk. She looked at the chair where he died, trying to imagine him there. How he must have slumped. And then, a voice so smooth it could have been made of velvet. At least he died doing what he loved. She turned, surprised, to see the man from the funeral in the overcoat and hat standing in the doorway. The scarf was still wrapped, the sunglasses still on, the fuzzy hair still poking out. His hands were gloved. "Yes," Stephanie said, because she couldn't think of anything else to say. "At least there's that." "You're one of his nieces, then?" the man asked. "You're not stealing anything. You're not breaking anything. So I'd guess you're Stephanie." She nodded and took the opportunity to look at him more closely. She couldn't see even the tiniest bit of his face beneath the scarf and sunglasses. "Were you a friend of his?" she asked. He was tall, this man, tall and thin, though his coat made it difficult to judge. "I was," he answered with a move of his head. This slight movement made her realize that the rest of his body was unnaturally still. "I've known him for years. Met him outside a bar in New York when I was over there, back when he had just published his first novel." Stephanie couldn't see anything behind the sunglasses. They were black as pitch. "Are you a writer too?" "Me? No. I wouldn't know where to start. But I got to live out my writer fantasies through Gordon." "You had writer fantasies?" "Doesn't everyone?" "I don't know, I don't think so." "Huh. Then that would make me seem kind of odd, wouldn't it?" "Well," Stephanie answered, "it would help." "Gordon used to talk about you all the time. Boast about his little niece. He was an individual of character, your uncle. It seems that you are too." "You say that like you know me." "Strong-willed, intelligent, sharp-tongued, doesn't suffer fools gladly. Remind you of anyone?" "Yes, Gordon." "Interesting," said the man, "because those are the exact words he used to describe you." His gloved fingers dipped into his waistcoat and brought out an ornate pocket watch on a delicate gold chain. "Good luck in whatever you decide to do with your life." "Thank you," Stephanie said, a little dumbly. "You too." She felt the man smile, although she could see no mouth, and he turned from the doorway and left her there. Stephanie found she couldn't take her eyes off where he had been. Who was he? She hadn't even got his name. She crossed over to the door and stepped out, wondering how he had vanished from sight so quickly. She hurried down the stairs and reached the large hall without seeing him. She opened the front door just as a big black car turned out onto the road. She watched him drive away, stayed there for a few moments, then reluctantly rejoined her extended family in the living room, just in time to see Fergus slip a silver ashtray into his breast pocket. Life in the Edgley household was fairly uneventful. Stephanie's mother worked in a bank and her father owned a construction company, and she had no brothers or sisters, so the routine they had settled into was one of amiable convenience. But even so, there was always the voice in the back of her mind telling her that there should be more to her life than this, more to her life than the small coastal town of Haggard. She just couldn't figure out what that something was. Her first year of secondary school had just come to a close, and she was looking forward to the summer break. Stephanie didn't like school. She found it difficult to get along with her classmates, not because they weren't nice people, but simply because she had nothing in common with them. And she didn't like teachers. She didn't like the way they demanded respect they hadn't earned. Stephanie had no problem doing what she was told, just so long as she was given a good reason why she should. She had spent the first few days of the summer helping out her father, answering phones and sorting through the files in his office. Gladys, his secretary of 7 years, had decided she'd had enough of the construction business and wanted to try her hand as a performance artist. Stephanie found it vaguely discomforting whenever she passed her on the street, this 43-year-old woman doing a modern dance interpretation of Faust. Gladys had made herself a costume to go with the act, a costume, she said, that symbolized the internal struggle Faust was going through, and apparently she refused to be seen in public without it. Stephanie did her best to avoid catching Gladys's eye. If Stephanie wasn't helping out in the office, she was either down at the beach swimming or locked in her room listening to music. She was in her room trying to find the charger for her mobile phone when her mother knocked on the door and stepped in. She was still dressed in the somber clothes she had worn to the funeral, though Stephanie had tied back her long dark hair and changed into her usual jeans and trainers within 2 minutes of returning to the house. "We got a call from Gordon's solicitor," her mother said, sounding a little surprised. "They want us at the reading of the will." "Oh?" Stephanie responded. "What do you think he left you?" "Well, we'll find out tomorrow." "You too, because you're coming with us." "I am?" Stephanie said with a slight frown. "Your name's on the list, that's all I know. We're leaving at 10, okay? I'm supposed to be helping Dad in the morning." He called Gladys, asked her to fill in for a few hours as a favor. She said yes, as long as she could wear the peanut suit. They left for the solicitors at 10:15 the next morning, 15 minutes later than planned thanks to Stephanie's father's casual disregard for punctuality. He ambled through the house, looking like there was something he'd forgotten, and he was just waiting for it to occur to him again. He nodded and smiled whenever his wife told him to hurry up, said, "Yes, absolutely," and just before he was due to join them in the car, he meandered off again, looking around with a dazed expression. "He does this on purpose," Stephanie's mother said as they sat in the car, seatbelts on and ready to go. They watched him appear at the front door, shrug into his jacket, tuck in his shirt, go to step out, and then pause. "He looks like he's about to sneeze," Stephanie remarked. "No," her mother responded. "He's just thinking." She stuck her head out of the window. "Desmond, what's wrong now?" He looked up, puzzled. "I think I'm forgetting something." Stephanie leaned forward in the back seat, took a look at him and spoke to her mother, who nodded and stuck her head out again. "Where are your shoes, dear?" He looked down at his socks. One brown, one navy, and his clouded expression cleared. He gave them the thumbs up and disappeared from view. "That man," her mother said, shaking her head. "Did you know he once lost a shopping centre?" "He what? I never told you that." "It was the first big contract he got. His company did a wonderful job, and he was driving his clients to see it, and he forgot where he put it. He drove around for almost an hour until he saw something he recognized. He may be a very talented engineer, but I swear he's got the attention span of a goldfish. So unlike Gordon." "They weren't very alike, were they?" Her mother smiled. "It wasn't always that way. They used to do everything together. The three of them were inseparable. What, even Fergus? Even Fergus. But when your grandmother died, they all drifted apart. Gordon started mixing with a strange crowd after that." "Strange? In what way?" "They probably just appeared strange to us," her mother said with a small laugh. Your dad was getting started in the construction business, and I was in college, and we were what you might call normal. Gordon resisted being normal, and his friends, they kind of scared us. We never knew what they were into, but we knew it wasn't anything normal. Exactly. They scared your dad most of all, though. Why? Stephanie's father walked out of the house, shoes on, and closed the front door after him. I think he was more like Gordon than he liked to let on, her mother said quietly, and then her dad got into the car. Okay, he said proudly. I'm ready. They looked at him as he nodded, chuffed with himself. He strapped on his seatbelt and turned the key. The engine purred to life. Stephanie waved to Jasper, an 8-year-old boy with unfortunate ears, as her dad backed out onto the road, put the car in gear, and they were off, narrowly missing their wheelie bin as they went. The drive to the solicitor's office in the city took a little under an hour, and they arrived 20 minutes late. They were led up a flight of creaky stairs to a small office, too warm to be comfortable, with a large window that offered a wonderful view of the brick wall across the street. Fergus and Beryl were there, and they showed their displeasure at having been kept waiting by looking at their watches and scowling. Stephanie's parents took the remaining chairs, and Stephanie stood behind them as the solicitor peered at them through cracked spectacles. Now can we get started? Beryl snapped. The solicitor, a short man named Mr. Fedgwick, with the girth and appearance of a sweaty bowling ball, tried, smiling. We still have one more person to wait on, he said, and Fergus's eyes bulged. Who? He demanded. There can't be anyone else? We are the only siblings Gordon had. Who is it? It's not some charity, is it? I've never trusted charities. They always want something from you. It's not a charity, Mr. Fedgwick said. He did say, however, that he might be a little late. Who said? Stephanie's father asked, and the solicitor looked down at the file open before him. A most unusual name, this, he said. It seems we are waiting on one Mr. Skulduggery Pleasant. Well, who on earth is that? Asked Beryl, irritated. He sounds like a... Fergus, what does he sound like? He sounds like a weirdo, Fergus said, glaring at Fedgwick. He's not a weirdo, is he? I really couldn't say, Fedgwick answered, his paltry excuse for a smile failing miserably under the glares he was getting from Fergus and Beryl. But I'm sure he'll be along soon. Fergus frowned, narrowing his beady eyes as much as was possible. How are you sure? Fedgwick faltered, unable to offer a reason, and then the door opened and the man in the tan overcoat entered the room. Sorry I'm late, he said, closing the door behind him. It was unavoidable, I'm afraid. Everyone in the room stared at him, stared at the scarf and the gloves and the sunglasses and the wild fuzzy hair. It was a glorious day outside, certainly not the kind of weather to be wrapped up like this. Stephanie looked closer at the hair. From this distance, it didn't even seem real. The solicitor cleared his throat. You are Skulduggery Pleasant? At your service, the man said. Stephanie could listen to that voice all day. Her mother, uncertain as she was, had smiled her greetings, but her father was looking at him with an expression of wariness she had never seen on his face before. After a moment, the expression left him, and he nodded politely and looked back to Mr. Fedgwick. Fergus and Beryl were still staring. Do you have something wrong with your face? Beryl asked. Fedgwick cleared his throat again. Okay then, let's get down to business now that we're all here. Excellent, good. This, of course, being the last will and testament of Gordon Edgley, revised last almost 1 year ago. Gordon has been a client of mine for the past 20 years, and in that time, I got to know him well. So let me pass on to you, his family and friend, my deepest... Yes, Fergus interrupted, waving his hand in the air. Can we just skip this part? We're already running behind schedule. Let's go to the part where we get stuff. Who gets the house and who gets the villa? Who gets the fortune? Beryl asked, leaning forward in her seat. The royalties, Fergus said. Who gets the royalties from the books? Stephanie glanced at Skulduggery Pleasant from the corner of her eye. He was standing back against the wall, hands in his pockets, looking at the solicitor. Well, he seemed to be looking at the solicitor. With those sunglasses, he could have been looking anywhere. She returned her gaze to Fedric as he picked up a page from his desk and read from it. "To my brother Fergus and his beautiful wife Beryl," he read, and Stephanie did her best to hide a grin. "I leave my car, and my boat, and a gift." Fergus and Beryl blinked. "His car," Fergus said. "His boat? Why would he leave me his boat?" "You hate the water," Beryl said, anger rising in her voice. "You get seasick." "I do get seasick," Fergus snapped, "and he knew that." "And we already have a car," Beryl said. "And we already have a car," Fergus repeated. Beryl was sitting so far up on her chair that she was almost on the desk. "This gift," she said, her voice low and threatening. "Is it the fortune?" Mr. Fedric coughed nervously and took a small box from his desk drawer and slid it towards them. They looked at this box. They looked some more. They both reached for it at the same time, and Stephanie watched them slap at each other's hands until Beryl snatched it off the desk and tore the lid open. "What is it?" Fergus asked in a small voice. "Is it a key to a safety deposit box? Is it an account number? Is it... What is it? Wife, what is it?" All colour had drained from Beryl's face and her hands were shaking. She blinked hard to keep the tears away. Then she turned the box for everyone to see, and everyone saw the brooch, about the size of a drinks coaster, nestled in the plush cushion. Fergus stared at it. "Doesn't even have any jewels on it," Beryl said, her voice strangled. Fergus opened his mouth wide like a startled fish and turned to Fedric. "What else do we get?" he asked, panicking. Mr. Fedric tried another smile. Your brother's love?" Stephanie heard a high-pitched whine, and it took her a moment to realize it was coming from Beryl. Fedric returned his attention to the will, trying to ignore the horrified looks he was getting from Fergus and his wife. "To my good friend and guide, Skulduggery Pleasant, I leave the following advice. Your path is your own, and I have no wish to sway you, but sometimes the greatest enemy we can face is ourselves, and the greatest battle is against the darkness within. There is a storm coming, and sometimes the key to safe harbour is hidden from us, and sometimes it is right before our eyes." Stephanie joined in with everyone else as they stared at Mr. Pleasant. She'd known there was something different about him. She had known it the first moment she saw him. There was something exotic, something mysterious, something dangerous. For his part, his head dipped lower, and that was the only reaction he gave. He offered no explanations as to what Gordon's message had meant. Fergus patted his wife's knee. "See, Beryl, a car, a boat, a brooch, it's not that bad. He could have given us some stupid advice." "Oh, shut up, would you?" Beryl snarled, and Fergus recoiled in his chair. Mr. Fedric read on. "To my other brother, Desmond, the lucky one of the family, I leave to you your wife. I think you might like her." Stephanie saw her parents clasp each other's hands and smile sadly. "So, now that you've successfully stolen my girlfriend, maybe you'd like to take her to my villa in France, which I am also leaving to you." "I get the villa?" Beryl cried, jumping to her feet. "Beryl," Fergus said, "please." "Do you know how much that villa is worth?" Beryl continued, looking like she might lunge at Stephanie's parents. "We get a brooch, they get a villa. There are only 3 of them. We've got Carol and Crystal. We have more. We could do with the extra space. Why do they deserve the villa?" She thrust the box towards them. "Swap!" "Mrs. Edgley, please retake your seat or we shall be unable to continue," Mr. Fedric said, and eventually, after much bug-eyed glaring, Beryl sat down. "Thank you," Fedric said, looking like he had had quite enough excitement for one day. He licked his lips, adjusted his glasses, and appeared again at the will. "If there is one regret that I have had in my life, it is that I have never fathered any children. There are times when I look at what Fergus and Beryl have produced, and I consider myself fortunate. But there are also times when it breaks my heart. And so, finally, to my niece, Stephanie." Stephanie's eyes widened. What? She was getting something? Leaving the villa to her parents wasn't enough for Gordon? Frederick continued reading. The world is bigger than you know, and scarier than you might imagine. The only currency worth anything is being true to yourself, and the only goal worth seeking is finding out who you truly are. She could feel Fergus and Beryl glaring at her, and she did her best to ignore them. Make your parents proud, and make them glad to have you living under their roof, because I leave to you my property and possessions, my assets and my royalties, to be inherited on the day you turn 18. I'd just like to take this opportunity to say that, in my own way, I love you all, even those I don't particularly like. That's you, Beryl. Frederick took off his spectacles and looked up. Stephanie became aware that everyone was staring at her, and she hadn't a clue what she was supposed to say. Fergus was again doing his startled fish impression, and Beryl was pointing one long bony finger at her, trying to speak but failing. Her parents were looking at her in stunned surprise. Only Skulduggery Pleasant moved, walking behind her and gently touching her arm. Congratulations, he said, and moved on towards the door. As soon as it clicked shut behind him, Beryl found her voice. Huh? She screamed. That afternoon, Stephanie and her mother took the 15-minute drive from Haggard to Gordon's estate. Her mum opened the front door and stepped back. Owner of the house goes first, she said with a little smile and a bow, and Stephanie stepped inside. She wasn't thinking of this house as her property. The idea was too big, too silly, even if her parents were technically the custodians until she turned 18. How could she own a house? How many other 12-year-old kids owned houses? No. It was too silly an idea, too far-fetched, too crazy, exactly the kind of thing that Gordon would have thought made perfect sense. The house was big and quiet and empty as they walked through it. Everything seemed new to her now, and Stephanie found herself reacting differently to the furniture and carpets and paintings. Did she like it? Did she agree with this color or that fabric? One thing that had to be said for Gordon, he had a good eye. Stephanie's mother said there was very little she would change if she had to. Some of the paintings were a little too unnerving for her taste, maybe, but on the whole the furnishings were elegant and understated, exuding an air of distinction that befitted a house of this stature. They hadn't decided what they were going to do with the house. Any decision was left up to Stephanie, but her parents still had the villa to consider. Owning 3 houses between them seemed a bit much. Her father had suggested selling the villa, but her mother hated the thought of letting go of a place so idyllic. They'd also talked about Stephanie's education, and she knew that conversation was far from over. The moment they had left Mr. Fedgwick's office, they warned her not to let all this go to her head. Recent events, they had said, should not mean she could stop studying, stop planning for college. She needed to be independent, they said. She needed to make it on her own. Stephanie had let them talk, and nodded occasionally and muttered an agreement where an agreement was appropriate. She didn't bother to explain that she needed college. She needed to find her own way in the world because she knew that if she didn't, she'd never escape Haggard. She wasn't about to throw her future away simply because she had come into some money. She and her mother spent so long looking around the ground floor that by the time they got to the bottom of the stairs, it was already 5 o'clock. With their exploring done for the day, they locked up and walked to the car. The first few drops of rain splattered against the windscreen as they got in. Stephanie clicked her seatbelt closed and her mother turned the key in the ignition. The car spluttered a bit, groaned a little, and then shut up altogether. Stephanie's mother looked at her. Uh-oh. They both got out and opened the bonnet. Well, her mother said, looking at the engine. At least that's still there. Do you know anything about engines? Stephanie asked. That's why I have a husband, so I don't have to. Engines and shelves, that's why man was invented. Stephanie made a mental note to learn about engines before she turned 18. She wasn't too fussed about the shelves. Her mum dug her mobile phone out of her bag and called Stephanie's dad, but he was busy on site and there was no way he could get to them before nightfall. They went back inside the house and her mother called a mechanic, and they spent 3/4 of an hour waiting for him to arrive. The sky was grey and angry, and the rain was falling hard by the time the truck appeared around the corner. It splashed through puddles on its way up the long drive, and Stephanie's mum pulled her jacket over her head and ran out to meet it. Stephanie could see a great big dog in the cab of the truck, looking on as the mechanic got out to examine their car. After a few minutes, her mother ran back inside, thoroughly drenched. "He can't fix it here," she said, wringing out her jacket on the porch. "So he's going to tow it to the garage. It shouldn't take too long to fix." "Will there be room for both of us in the truck?" "You can sit on my knee." "Mom?" "Or I can sit on your knee, whatever works." "Can I stay here?" Her mother looked at her. "On your own? Please? You just said it won't take long, and I'd like to have another look around, just on my own." "I don't know, Steph. Please? I've stayed on my own before. I won't break anything, I swear." Her mother laughed. "Okay, fine. I shouldn't be any more than an hour, all right? An hour and a half at the most." Her mother gave her a quick kiss on the cheek. "Call me if you need anything." She ran back outside and jumped in the cab next to the dog, who proceeded to slobber all over her face. Stephanie watched their car being towed off into the distance, and then it vanished from sight. She did a little more exploring now that she was on her own. She climbed the stairs and went straight to Gordon's study. His publisher, Seamus T. Steep of Arclight Books, had phoned them earlier that day, passing on his condolences and inquiring about the state of Gordon's last book. Her mother had told him that they'd find out if Gordon had completed it, and if he had, they'd send it on. Mr. Steep was very keen to get the book on the shelves, certain that it would crash onto the bestseller list and stay there for a long time. "Dead writers sell," he had said, like he approved of Gordon's clever marketing ploy. Stephanie opened the desk drawer and found the manuscript in a neat stack. She pulled it out carefully and laid it on the desktop, careful not to smudge the paper. The first page held the title, nothing more, in bold lettering. "And the darkness reigned upon them." The manuscript was thick and heavy, like all of Gordon's books. She'd read most of them, and the odd splash of pretension aside, had quite enjoyed his work. His stories tended to be about people who could do astonishing and wonderful things, and the strange and terrible events that invariably led up to their bizarre and horrible deaths. She noticed the way he would set up a strong and noble hero, and over the course of the book systematically subject this hero to brutal punishment in a bid to strip away all his arrogance and certainty, so that by the end he was humbled and had learned a great lesson. And then Gordon killed him off, usually in the most undignified way possible. Stephanie could almost hear Gordon laughing with mischievous glee as she'd read. She lifted the title page and carefully laid it face down on the desk beside the manuscript. She started reading. She didn't mean to spend long at it, but soon she was devouring every word, oblivious to the creaking old house and the rain outside. Her mobile phone rang, making her jump. She'd been reading for 2 hours. She pressed the answer button and held it to her ear. "Hi, sweetie," came her mother's voice. "Everything okay?" "Yes," Stephanie answered. "Just reading." "You're not reading one of Gordon's books, are you?" "Steph, he writes about horrible monsters and scary stuff and bad people doing worse things. It'll give you nightmares." "No, Mum, I'm reading the dictionary." Even the brief silence from the other end of the phone was skeptical. "The dictionary?" her mother said. "Really?" "Yeah," Stephanie said. "Did you know that popple is a word?" "You are stranger than your father, you know that." "I suspected as much. So is the car fixed yet?" "No, and that's why I'm calling. They can't get it going, and the road up to you is flooded. I'm going to get a taxi up as far as it'll go, and then I'll see if I can find some way around on foot. It's going to be another 2 hours at least." Stephanie sensed an opportunity. Ever since she was a child, she had much preferred her own company to the company of others, and it occurred to her that she had never spent a whole night without her parents nearby. A small taste of freedom, and it almost tingled on her tongue. "Mom, it's fine. You don't have to. I'm okay here. There's no way I'm leaving you in a strange house by yourself." It's not a strange house, it's Gordon's and it's fine. There's no point in you trying to get here tonight. It's lashing rain. Sweetie, it won't take me long. It'll take you ages. Where's it flooded? Her mother paused. At the bridge. The bridge? And you want to walk from the bridge to here? If I speed walk... Mom, don't be silly. Get Dad to pick you up. Sweetheart, are you sure? I like it here, really. Okay? Well, okay, her mother said reluctantly. I'll be over first thing in the morning to pick you up, all right? And I saw some food in the cupboard, so if you're hungry, you can make yourself something. Okay. I'll see you tomorrow then. Call us if you need anything, or if you just want some company. I will. Night, Mum. I love you. I know. Stephanie hung up and grinned. She slipped the phone back into her jacket and put her feet up on the desk, relaxing back into the chair, and went back to reading. When she looked up again, she was surprised to find that it was almost midnight, and the rain had stopped. If she were home right now, she'd be in bed. She blinked, her eyes sore, stood up from the desk, and went downstairs to the kitchen. For all his wealth and success and extravagant tastes, she was thankful that when it came to food, Gordon was a pretty standard guy. The bread was stale and the fruit was a bit too ripe, but there were biscuits and there was cereal and the milk in the fridge was still good for one more day. Stephanie made herself a snack and wandered to the living room where she flicked on the TV. She sat on the couch and was just getting comfy when the house phone rang. She looked at it, resting there on the table at her elbow. Who would be calling? Anyone who knew Gordon had died wouldn't be calling because they'd know he had died, and she didn't really want to be the one to tell anyone who didn't know. It could be her parents, but then why didn't they just call her mobile? Figuring that as the new owner of the house it was her responsibility to answer her own phone, Stephanie picked it up and held it to her ear. Hello? Silence. Hello? Stephanie repeated. Who is this? Came a man's voice. I'm sorry, Stephanie said. Who do you want to speak to? Who is this? Responded the voice, more irritably this time. If you're looking for Gordon Edgley, Stephanie said, I'm afraid that he's... I know Edgley's dead, snapped the man. Who are you? Your name? Stephanie hesitated. Why do you want to know? She asked. What are you doing in that house? Why are you in his house? If you want to call back tomorrow... I don't want to, all right? Listen to me, girlie. If you mess up my master's plans, he'll be very displeased. And he's not a man you want to displease. You got that? Now tell me who you are. Stephanie realized her hands were shaking. She forced herself to calm down and quickly found anger replacing her nervousness. My name is none of your business, she said. If you want to talk to someone, call back tomorrow at a reasonable hour. You don't talk to me like that, the man hissed. Good night, Stephanie said firmly. You do not talk to me like... But Stephanie was already putting the phone down. Suddenly the idea of spending the whole night here wasn't as appealing as it had first sounded. She considered calling her parents, then scolded herself for being so childish. No need to worry them, she thought to herself. No need to worry them about something so... Someone pounded on the front door. Open up! Came the man's voice between the pounding. Stephanie got to her feet, staring through the hall beyond the living room. She could see a dark shape behind the frosted glass around the front door. Open the damn door! Stephanie backed up to the fireplace, her heart pounding in her chest. He knew she was in there. There was no use pretending that she wasn't. But maybe, if she stayed really quiet, he'd give up and go away. She heard him cursing, and the pounding grew so heavy that the front door rattled under the blows. Leave me alone! Stephanie shouted. Open the door! No! She shouted back. She liked shouting. It disguised her fear. I'm calling the police! I'm calling the police right now! The pounding stopped immediately, and Stephanie saw the shape move away from the door. Was that it? Had she scared him away? She thought of the back door. Was it locked? Of course it was locked. It had to be locked. But she wasn't sure, she wasn't certain. She grabbed a poker from the fireplace and was reaching for the phone when she heard a knock on the window beside her. She cried out and jumped back. The curtains were open, and outside the window was pitch black. She couldn't see a thing. "Are you alone in there?" came the voice. It was teasing now, playing with her. "Go away!" she said loudly, holding up the poker so he could see it. She heard the man laugh. "What are you going to do with that?" he asked. "I'll break your head open with it!" Stephanie screamed at him, fear and fury bubbling inside her. She heard him laugh again. "I just want to come in," he said. "Open the door for me, girlie. Let me come in." "The police are on their way," she said. "You're a liar." Still, she could see nothing beyond the glass, and he could see everything. She moved to the phone, snatching it from its cradle. "Don't do that," came the voice. "I'm calling the police." "The road's closed, girlie. You call them, I'll break down that door and kill you hours before they get here." Fear became terror, and Stephanie froze. She was going to cry. She could feel it, the tears welling up inside her. She hadn't cried in years. "What do you want?" she said to the darkness. "Why do you want to come in?" "It's got nothing to do with me, girlie. I've just been sent to pick something up. Let me in. I'll look around, get what I came here for and leave. I won't harm a pretty little hair on your pretty little head, I promise. Now you just open that door right this second." Stephanie gripped the poker in both hands and shook her head. She was crying now, tears rolling down her cheeks. "No," she said. She screamed as a fist smashed through the window, showering the carpet with glass. She stumbled back as the man started climbing in, glaring at her with blazing eyes, unmindful of the glass that cut into him. The moment one foot touched the floor inside the house, Stephanie was bolting out of the room, over to the front door, fumbling at the lock. Strong hands grabbed her from behind. She screamed again as she was lifted off her feet and carried back. She kicked out, slamming a heel into his shin. The man grunted and let go, and Stephanie twisted, trying to swing the poker into his face, but he caught it and pulled it from her grasp. One hand went to her throat, and Stephanie gagged, unable to breathe as the man forced her back into the living room. He pushed her into an armchair and leaned over her, and no matter how hard she tried, she could not break his grip. "Now then," the man said, his mouth contorting into a sneer. "Why don't you just give me the key, little girlie?" And that's when the front door was flung off its hinges and Skulduggery Pleasant burst into the house. The man cursed and released Stephanie and swung the poker, but Skulduggery moved straight to him and hit him so hard Stephanie thought the man's head might come off. He hit the ground and tumbled backwards, but rolled to his feet as Skulduggery moved in again. The man launched himself forward. They both collided and went backwards over the couch, and Skulduggery lost his hat. Stephanie saw a flash of white above the scarf. They got to their feet, grappling, and the man swung a punch that knocked Skulduggery's sunglasses to the other side of the room. Skulduggery responded by moving in low, grabbing the man around the waist and twisting his hip into him. The man was flipped to the floor hard. He cursed a little more, then remembered Stephanie and made for her. Stephanie leapt out of the chair, but before he could reach her, Skulduggery was there, kicking the man's legs out from under him. The man hit a small coffee table with his chin and howled in pain. "Oh, you think you can stop me?" he screamed as he tried to stand. His knees seemed shaky. "Do you know who I am?" "Haven't the foggiest," Skulduggery said. The man spat blood and grinned defiantly. "Well, I know about you," he said. "My master told me all about you, detective, and you're going to have to do a lot more than that to stop me." Skulduggery shrugged, and Stephanie watched in amazement as a ball of fire flared up in his hand, and he hurled it, and the man was suddenly covered in flame. But instead of screaming, the man tilted his head back and roared with laughter. The fire may have engulfed him, but it wasn't burning him. "More!" he laughed. "Give me more!" "If you insist." And then Skulduggery took an old-fashioned revolver from his jacket and fired, the gun bucking slightly with the recoil. The bullet hit the man in the shoulder, and he screamed, then tried to run and tripped. He scrambled for the doorway, ducking and dodging lest he get shot again, the flames obstructing his vision so much that he hit a wall on his way out. And then he was gone. Stephanie stared at the door, trying to make sense of the impossible. "Well," Skulduggery said, That's something you don't see every day. She turned. When his hat came off, his hair had come off too. In the confusion, all she had seen was a chalk-white scalp, so she turned expecting to see a bald albino maybe. But no. With the sunglasses gone and his scarf hanging down, there was no denying the fact that he had no flesh, he had no skin, he had no eyes, and he had no face. All he had was a skull for a head. Skulduggery put his gun away and walked out to the hall. He peered out into the night. Satisfied that there were no human fireballs lurking anywhere nearby, he came back inside and picked the door off the ground, grunting with the effort. He maneuvered it back to where it belonged, leaving it leaning in the doorway. Then he shrugged and came back into the living room, where Stephanie was still standing and staring at him. "Sorry about the door," he said. Stephanie stared. "I'll pay to get it fixed." Stephanie stared. "It's still a good door, you know. Sturdy." When he realized that Stephanie was in no condition to do anything but stare, he shrugged again and took off his coat, folded it neatly, and draped it over the back of a chair. He went to the broken window and started picking up the shards of glass. Now that he didn't have his coat on, Stephanie could truly appreciate how thin he really was. His suit, well tailored though it was, hung off him, giving it a shapeless quality. She watched him collect the broken glass and saw a flash of bone between his shirt sleeve and glove. He stood, looking back at her. "Where should I put all this glass?" "I don't know," Stephanie said in a quiet voice. "You're a skeleton." "I am indeed," he said. "Gordon used to keep a wheelie bin out at the back door. Shall I put it in that?" Stephanie nodded. "Yes, okay," she said simply, and watched Skulduggery carry the armful of glass shards out of the room. All her life she had longed for something else, for something to take her out of the humdrum world she knew. And now that it looked like it might actually happen, she didn't have one clue what to do. Questions were tripping over themselves in her head, each one vying to be the one that was asked first. So many of them. Skulduggery came back in and she asked the first question. "Did you find it all right?" "I did, yes. It was where he always kept it." "Okay then." If questions were people, she felt that they'd all be staring at her now in disbelief. She struggled to form coherent thoughts. "Did you tell him your name?" Skulduggery was asking. "What?" "Your name. Did you tell him?" No." "Good. You know something's true name, you have power over it. But even a given name, even Stephanie, that would have been enough to do it." "To do what?" "To give him some influence over you. To get you to do what he asked. If he had your name and he knew what to do with it, sometimes that's all it takes. That's a scary thought now, isn't it?" "What's going on?" Stephanie asked. "Who was he? What did he want? Just who are you?" "I'm me," Skulduggery said, picking up his hat and wig and placing them on a nearby table. "As for him, I don't know who he is, never seen him before in my life." "You shot him?" "That's right." "And you threw fire at him?" "Yes, I did." Stephanie's legs felt weak and her head felt light. "Mr. Pleasant, you're a skeleton." "Ah, yes, back to the crux of the matter. Yes, I am, as you say, a skeleton. I have been one for a few years now." "Am I going mad?" "I hope not." "So you're real? You actually exist?" "Presumably." "You mean you're not sure if you exist or not?" "I'm fairly certain. I mean, I could be wrong. I could be some ghastly hallucination, a figment of my imagination." "You might be a figment of your own imagination." "Stranger things have happened, and do, with alarming regularity." "This is too weird." Skulduggery put his gloved hands in his pockets and cocked his head. He had no eyeballs, so it was hard to tell if he was looking at her or not. "You know, I met your uncle under similar circumstances. Well, kind of similar, but he was drunk. And we were in a bar. And he had vomited on my shoes, so I suppose the actual circumstances aren't overly similar, but both events include a meeting, so my point is, he was having some trouble, and I was there to lend a hand, and we became good friends after that. Good friends. His head tilted. You look like you might faint. Stephanie nodded slowly. I've never fainted before, but I think you might be right. Do you want me to catch you if you fall, or... If you wouldn't mind. No problem at all. Thank you. Stephanie gave him a weak smile, and then darkness clouded her vision, and she felt herself falling, and the last thing she saw was Skulduggery Pleasant darting across the room towards her. Stephanie awoke on the couch with a blanket over her. The room was dark, lit only by 2 lamps in opposite corners. She looked over at the broken window, saw that it was now boarded up. She heard a hammering from the hall, and when she felt strong enough to stand, she slowly rose and walked out of the living room. Skulduggery Pleasant was trying to hang the door back on its hinges. He had his shirt sleeve rolled up on his left forearm. Ulna, Stephanie corrected herself, proving that her first year of biology class had not gone to waste. Or was it Radius? Or both? She heard him mutter, then he noticed her and nodded brightly. Ah, you're up. You fixed the window. Well, covered it up. Gordon had a few pieces of timber out back, so I did what I could. Not having the same luck with the door, though. I find it much easier to blast them off than put them back. How are you feeling? I'm okay, Stephanie said. A cup of hot tea, that's what you need, lots of sugar. He abandoned the door and guided her to the kitchen. She sat at the table while he boiled the water. Hungry? He asked when it had boiled. But she shook her head. Milk? She nodded. He added milk and spoonfuls of sugar, gave the tea a quick stir and put the cup on the table in front of her. She took a sip. It was hot, but nice. Thank you, Stephanie said, and he gave a little shrug. It was hard discerning some of his gestures without a face to go by, but she took the shrug to mean, think nothing of it. Was that magic? With the fire and blasting the door? Yes, it was. She peered closer. How can you talk? Sorry? How can you talk? You move your mouth when you speak, but you've got no tongue, you've got no lips, you've got no vocal cords. I mean, I know what skeletons look like. I've seen diagrams and models and stuff, and the only things that hold them together are flesh and skin and ligaments, so why don't you just fall apart? He gave another shrug, both shoulders this time. Well, that's magic too. She looked at him. Magic's pretty handy. Yes, magic is. And what about, nerve endings? Can you feel pain? I can, but that's not a bad thing. Pain lets you know when you're alive, after all. And are you alive? Well, technically, no, but... She peered into his empty eye sockets. Do you have a brain? He laughed. I don't have a brain, I don't have any organs, but I have a consciousness. He started clearing away the sugar in the milk. To be honest with you, it's not even my head. What? It's not. They ran away with my skull. I won this one in a poker game. That's not even yours. How does it feel? It'll do. It'll do until I finally get around to getting my own head back. You look faintly disgusted. Doesn't it feel weird? It'd be like wearing someone else's socks. You get used to it. What happened to you? She asked. Were you born like this? No, I was born perfectly normal. Skin, organs, the whole shebang. Even had a face that wasn't too bad to look at if I do say so myself. So what happened? Skulduggery leaned against the worktop, arms folded across his chest. I got into magic. Back then, back when I was, for want of a better term, alive. There were some pretty nasty people around. The world was seeing a darkness it might never have recovered from. It was war, you see. A secret war, but war nonetheless. There was a sorcerer, malevolent, worse than any of the others, and he had himself an army. Those of us who refused to fall in behind him found ourselves standing up against him. And we were winning. Eventually, after years of fighting this little war of ours, we were actually winning. His support was crumbling, His influence was fading, and he was staring defeat in the face. So he ordered one last, desperate strike against all the leaders on our side.
Stephanie stared at him, lost in his voice.
I went up against his right-hand man, who had laid out a wickedly exquisite trap. I didn't suspect a thing until it was too late. So, I died. He killed me. 23rd of October, it was, and my heart stopped beating. Once I was dead, they stuck my body up on a pike and burned it for all to see. They used me as a warning. They used the bodies of all the leaders they had killed as warnings. And to my utter horror, it worked.
What do you mean?
The tide turned. Our side started losing ground. Malevolent got stronger. It was more than I could stand, so I came back.
You just came back?
It's complicated. When I died, I never moved on. Something was holding me here, making me watch. I've never heard of it happening before that, and I haven't heard of it happening since, but it happened to me. So, when it got too much, I woke up, a bag of bones. Literally. They had gathered up my bones and put them in a bag and thrown the bag into a river. So, that was a marvelous new experience right there.
Then what happened?
I put myself back together, which was rather painful, then climbed out of the river and rejoined the fight, and in the end, we won. We finally won. So, with Malevolent defeated, I quit that whole scene and struck out on my own for the first time in a few 100 years.
Stephanie blinked. Few 100?
It was a long war.
That man, he called you detective.
He obviously knows me by reputation, Skulduggery said, standing a little straighter. I solve mysteries now.
Really?
Quite good at it, too.
So, what, you're tracking down your head?
Skulduggery looked at her.
If he'd had eyelids, he might well be blinking.
It'd be nice to have it back, sure, but...
So, you don't need it, so you can rest in peace?
No, not really.
Why did they take it? Was that another warning?
Oh, no, Skulduggery said with a little laugh. No, they didn't take it. I was sleeping, about 10 or 15 years ago, and these little goblin things ran up and nicked it right off my spinal column. Didn't notice it was gone till the next morning.
Stephanie frowned. And you didn't feel that?
Well, like I said, I was asleep. Meditating, I suppose you'd call it. I can't see, hear, or feel anything when I'm meditating. Have you tried it?
No.
It's very relaxing. I think you'd like it.
I'm sorry, I'm still stuck on you losing your head.
I didn't lose it, he said defensively. It was stolen.
Stephanie was feeling stronger now. She couldn't believe that she'd fainted. Fainted? It was such an old woman thing to do. She glanced up at Skulduggery. You've had a very unusual life, haven't you?
I suppose I have. Not over yet, though. Well, technically it is, but...
Isn't there anything you miss?
About what?
About living?
Compared to how long I've been like this, I was only technically alive for a blink of an eye. I can't really remember enough about having a beating heart in my chest to miss it.
So there's nothing you miss?
I suppose I miss hair. I miss how it was, and how it was there, on top of my head. I suppose I miss my hair.
He took out his pocket watch and his head jerked back.
Wow, look at the time. I've got to go, Stephanie.
Go where?
Things to do, I'm afraid. Number 1 is finding out why that nice gentleman was sent here, and number 2 is finding out who sent him.
You can't leave me alone, she said, following him into the living room.
Yes, he corrected. I can. You'll be perfectly safe.
The front door's off.
Well, yes. You'll be perfectly safe as long as they don't come through the front door.
He pulled on his coat, but she snatched his hat away.
Are you taking my hat hostage? He asked doubtfully.
You're either staying here to make sure no one else attacks me, or you're taking me with you.
Skulduggery froze. That, he said eventually, wouldn't be too safe for you.
Neither would being left here on my own.
"But you can hide," he said, gesturing around the room. "There's so many places to hide. I'm sure there are plenty of good solid wardrobes your size, even under a bed. You'd be surprised how many people don't check under beds these days."
"Mr. Pleasant."
"Skulduggery, please."
"Skulduggery, you saved my life tonight. Are you going to undo all that effort by leaving me here so someone else can come along and just kill me?"
"That's a very defeatist attitude you've got there. I once knew a fellow, a little older than you. He wanted to join me in my adventures, wanted to solve mysteries that beggared belief. He kept asking, kept on at me about it. He finally proved himself after a long time, and we became partners."
"And did you go on to have lots of exciting adventures?"
"I did. He didn't. He died on our very first case together. Horrible death. Messy too, lots of flailing around."
"Well, I don't plan on dying anytime soon, and I've got something he didn't."
"And that is?"
"Your hat. Take me with you, or I'll stand on it."
Skulduggery looked at her with his big hollow eye sockets, then held out his hand for his hat. "Don't say I didn't warn you."
Skulduggery Pleasant's car was a 1954 Bentley R-Type Continental, one of only 208 ever made. A car that housed a 6-cylinder 4.5-litre engine and was retrofitted with central locking, climate control, satellite navigation and a host of other modern conveniences. Skulduggery told Stephanie all of this when she asked. She'd have been happy with, "It's a Bentley." They left Gordon's land via a back road at the rear of the estate to avoid the flooding, a road that Stephanie hadn't even noticed until they were on it. Skulduggery told her he was a regular visitor here and knew all the little nooks and crannies. They passed a sign for Haggard, and she thought about asking him to drop her home, but quickly banished that idea from her head. If she went home now, she'd be turning her back on everything she'd just seen. She needed to know more. She needed to see more. "Where are we going?" she asked as they drove on.
"Into the city. I've got a meeting with an old friend. She might be able to shed some light on recent events."
"Why were you at the house?"
"Sorry?"
"Tonight. Not that I'm not grateful, but how come you happen to be nearby?"
"Ah," he said, nodding. "Yes, I can see how that question would arise."
"So, are you going to answer it?"
"That's unlikely."
"Well, why not?"
He glanced at her, or at least he turned his head a fraction. "The less you know about others, the better. You're a perfectly normal young lady, and after tonight you're going to return to your perfectly normal life. It wouldn't do for you to get too involved in this."
"But I am involved."
"But we can limit that involvement."
"But I don't want to limit that involvement."
"But it's what's best for you."
"But I don't want that."
"But it might."
Don't start another sentence with "but."
"Right. Sorry."
"You can't expect me to forget about all of this. I've seen magic and fire in you, and I've learned about wars they don't tell us about in school. I've seen a world I never even knew existed."
"Don't you want to get back to that world? It's safer there."
"That's not where I belong."
Skulduggery turned his whole head to her and cocked it at an angle. "Funny. When I first met your uncle, that's what he said too."
"The things he wrote about,"
Stephanie said, the idea just dawning on her.
"Are they true?"
"His books? No, not a one.
Oh.
They're more inspired by true stories, really. He just changed them enough so he wouldn't insult anyone and get hunted down and killed. Your uncle was a good man. He really was. We solved many mysteries together."
"Really?"
"Oh, yes. You should be proud to have had an uncle like him. Of course, he got me into 100 fights because I'd bring him somewhere and he wouldn't stop pestering people, but fun times. Fun times."
They drove on until they saw the lights of the city looming ahead. Soon the darkness that surrounded the car was replaced with an orange haze that reflected off the wet roads. The city was quiet and still, the streets almost empty. They pulled into a small outdoor car park and Skulduggery switched off the engine and looked at Stephanie.
"Okay, then you wait here."
"Right." He got out. 2 seconds passed, but Stephanie hadn't tagged along just to wait on the sidelines. She needed to see what other surprises the world had in store for her.
She got out and Skulduggery looked at her.
Stephanie, I'm not altogether sure you're respecting my authority.
No, I'm not.
I see. Okay then.
He put on his hat and wrapped his scarf around his jaw, but did without the wig and the sunglasses. He clicked his keyring and the car beeped and the doors locked. That's it? He looked up.
Sorry?
Aren't you afraid it might get stolen? We're not exactly in a good part of town.
It's got a car alarm.
Don't you cast a spell or something to keep it safe?
No. It's a pretty good car alarm.
He started walking. She hurried to keep up.
Do you cast spells then?
Sometimes. I try not to depend on magic these days. I try to get by on what's up here.
He tapped his head.
There's empty space up there.
Well, yes,
Skulduggery said irritably, but you know what I mean.
What else can you do?
Sorry?
With magic. Show me something.
If Skulduggery had eyebrows, they would most likely be arched.
What, a living skeleton isn't enough for you? You want more?
Yes, Stephanie said. Give me a tutorial.
He shrugged. Well, I suppose it couldn't hurt. There are two types of mages, or sorcerers. Adepts practice one branch of magic, elementals practice another. Adepts are more aggressive. Their techniques are more immediately powerful. In contrast, an elemental, such as myself, chooses the quieter course and works on mastering their command of the elements.
Command of the elements?
Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration. We don't command them as such. We manipulate them. We influence them.
Like what? Like earth, wind,
water, and fire, yes.
So show me.
Skulduggery tilted his head a little to the right, and she could hear the good humor in his voice. Very well,
he said, and held up his open hand in front of her. She frowned, feeling a little chilly, and then she became aware of a droplet of water running down her face. In an instant her hair was drenched, like she'd just surfaced from a dive.
How did you do that?
She asked, shaking her head, flinging drops of water away from her.
You tell me,
Skulduggery answered.
I don't know. You did something to the moisture in the air?
He looked down at her.
Very good,
he said, impressed.
The first element, water. We can't part the Red Sea or anything, but we have a little influence with it.
Show me fire again,
Stephanie said eagerly. Skulduggery snapped his gloved fingers and sparks flew, and he curled his hand and the sparks grew to flame, and he held that ball of flame in his palm as they walked. The flame intensified, and Stephanie could feel her hair drying.
Wow,
she said.
Wow indeed,
Skulduggery responded and thrust his hand out, sending the ball of fire shooting through the air. It burned out as it arced in the night sky, and faded to nothing.
What about Earth?
Stephanie asked, but Skulduggery shook his head.
You don't want to see that, and hopefully you'll never have to. The Earth power is purely defensive and purely for use as a last resort.
So what's the most powerful? Is it fire?
That's the flashiest. That gets all the wows. But you'd be surprised what a little air can do if you displace it properly. Displaced air doesn't just disappear. It needs somewhere to be displaced to.
Can I see?
They reached the edge of the car park and passed the low wall that encircled it. Skulduggery flexed his fingers and suddenly splayed his hand, snapping his palm towards the wall. The air rippled and the bricks exploded outwards. Stephanie stared at the brand new hole in the wall.
That,
she said,
is so cool.
They walked on, Stephanie glancing back at the wall every so often.
What about the adepts then? What can they do?
I knew a fellow a few years ago who could read minds. I met this woman once who could change her shape, become anyone, right in front of your eyes.
So who's stronger?
Stephanie asked.
An elemental or an adept?
Depends on the mage. An adept could have so many tricks up his sleeve, so many different abilities that he could prove himself stronger than even the most powerful elemental. That's been known to happen.
The sorcerer, the worst one of all, was he an adept?
Actually, no. Malevolent was an elemental.
It's rare that you get an elemental straying so far down the dark paths, but it happens. There was a question Stephanie had been dying to ask, but she didn't want to appear too eager. As casually as she could, thumbs hooked into the belt loops of her jeans, she said, as if she had just plucked this thought out of thin air,
So, how do you know if you can do magic? Can anyone do it?
Not anyone. Relatively few, actually. Those who can usually congregate in the same areas, so there are small pockets of communities all over the world. In Ireland and the United Kingdom alone, there are 18 different neighborhoods populated solely by sorcerers.
Can you be a sorcerer without realizing it?
Oh, yes. Some people walk around every day, bored with their lives, having no idea that there's a world of wonder at their fingertips. And they'll live out their days completely oblivious, and they'll die without knowing how great they could have been.
That's really sad.
Actually, it's quite amusing.
No, it's not. It's sad. How would you like it if you never discovered what you could do?
I wouldn't know any better, Skulduggery answered, stopping beside her. We're here.
Stephanie looked up. They'd arrived outside a crumbling old tenement building, its wall defaced with graffiti and its windows cracked and dirty. She followed him up the concrete steps and into the foyer, and together they ascended the sagging staircase. The first floor was quiet and smelled of damp. On the second floor, splintered shards of light escaped through the cracks between door and doorway into the otherwise dark corridor. They could hear the sound of a TV from one of the apartments. When they got to the third floor, Stephanie knew they'd arrived. The third floor was clean. It didn't smell, and it was well lit. It was like an entirely different building. She followed Skulduggery to the middle of the corridor and noticed that none of the doors were numbered. She looked at the door Skulduggery knocked on, the door that had a plaque fastened to it. Library. While they waited there, Skulduggery said,
One more thing. No matter how much you might want to, do not tell her your name.
The door opened before she could ask any more questions, and a thin man with large round spectacles peered out. His nose was hooked and his wiry hair was receding. He wore a checked suit with a bow tie. He glanced at Stephanie, then nodded to Skulduggery and opened the door wide for them to come through. Stephanie realized why none of the doors were numbered. It was because they all led into the same room. The walls between apartments had been taken away in order to accommodate the vast number of books on the shelves. Stacks and stacks of books, a labyrinth of bookshelves that stretched from one side of the building to the other. As they followed the bespectacled man through the maze, she saw more people, their attention focused on their reading, people half hidden in shadow, people who didn't look exactly right. In the middle of the library was an open space, like a clearing in a forest, and in this open space stood the most beautiful woman Stephanie had ever seen. Her hair was black as raven wings, and her eyes were the palest blue. Her features were so delicate, Stephanie feared they might break if she smiled. And then the lady smiled, and Stephanie felt such warmth that for an instant she never wanted to be anywhere else but at this lady's side.
Stop that,
said Skulduggery. The lady let her eyes move to him, and her smile turned playful. Stephanie stared, enraptured. Her body felt so heavy, so clumsy. All she wanted to do with her life was just stand here, in this spot, and gaze at pure and true beauty.
Stop that,
Skulduggery said again, and the lady laughed and shrugged and looked back at Stephanie.
Sorry about that,
she said, and Stephanie felt a fog lift from her mind. She felt dizzy and staggered. But Skulduggery was there, a hand on the small of her back, supporting her.
My apologies,
the lady said, giving her a small bow.
I do forget the effect I have on people. First impressions and all that.
Seems like every time you meet someone new, you forget that little fact,
Skulduggery said.
I'm a scatterbrain. What can I say?
Skulduggery grunted and turned to Stephanie.
Don't feel self-conscious. The first time anyone sets eyes on China, they fall in love. Believe me, the effect lessens the more you get to know her.
Lessons?
the woman named China said.
But never entirely goes away, does it, Skulduggery?
The detective took off his hat and looked at China, but ignored her question. China smiled at Stephanie and handed her a business card. It was eggshell white and bore a single telephone number, etched with delicate elegance.
Feel free to call me if you ever stumble across a book or an item you think I might be interested in. Skulduggery used to. He doesn't anymore. Too much water has flowed under that proverbial bridge, I'm afraid. Oh, where are my manners? My name is China Sorrows, my dear. And you are?
Stephanie was about to tell China her name when Skulduggery turned his head to her sharply, and she remembered what he had said. She frowned. The urge to tell this woman everything was almost overwhelming. You don't need to know her name, Skulduggery said. All you need to know is that she witnessed someone breaking into Gordon Edgley's house. He was looking for something. What would Gordon have that someone might want?
You don't know who he was?
He wasn't anyone. His master, that's who I'm after.
So, who do you think his master is?
Skulduggery didn't answer, and China laughed.
Serpine again? My darling, you think Serpine is the culprit behind practically every crime.
That's because he is.
So, why come to me?
You hear things.
Do I?
People talk to you.
I am very approachable.
I was wondering if you'd heard anything. Rumors, whispers, anything.
Nothing that would help you.
But you have heard something.
I've heard nonsense. I've heard something that doesn't even deserve to be called a rumor. Apparently, Serpine has been making inquiries about the Scepter of the Ancients.
What about it?
He's looking for it.
What do you mean? The Scepter's a fairy tale.
Like I said, it's nonsense.
Skulduggery fell silent for a moment, as if he was storing that piece of information away for further study. When he spoke again, it was with a new line of questioning. So, what would Gordon have that he, or anyone else, might want?
Probably quite a lot,
China answered.
Dear Gordon was like me. He was a collector. But I don't think that's the question you should be asking.
Skulduggery thought for a moment. Stephanie looked at the two of them.
What? What?
The question, Skulduggery said, is not what did Gordon have that someone might want to steal, but rather what did Gordon have that someone had to wait until he was dead in order to steal it. Stephanie looked at him.
There's a difference?
China answered her.
There are items that cannot be taken, possessions that cannot be stolen. In such a case, the owner must be dead before anyone else can take advantage of its powers.
If you hear anything that might be of use, Skulduggery said, will you let me know?
And what do I get in return?
China responded, that smile playing on her lips again. My appreciation.
Tempting. That is tempting.
Then how about this? Skulduggery said. Do it as a favor, for a friend.
A friend?
China said.
After all these years? After everything that's happened? Are you saying that you're my friend again?
I was talking about Gordon. China laughed and Stephanie followed Skulduggery as he walked back through the stacks. They left the library and travelled back the way they'd come. When they were out on the street, Stephanie spoke up at last.
So that was China Sorrows, she said.
Yes, that was, Skulduggery responded. A woman not to be trusted.
Beautiful name, though.
Like I said, names are power. There are 3 names for everyone. The name you're born with, the name you're given, and the name you take. Everyone, no matter who they are, is born with a name. You were born with a name. Do you know what it is?
Is this a trick question?
Do you know what your name is?
Yes, Stephanie Edgley.
No.
No?
That's your given name. That's the name other people handed you. If a mage with any kind of knowledge wanted to, he could use that name to influence you, to attain some small degree of control, to make you stand, sit, speak, Things like that.
Like a dog?
I suppose so.
You're likening me to a dog?
No, he said, then paused. Well, yes.
Oh, cheers.
But you have another name, a real name, a true name, a name unique to you and you alone.
What is it?
I don't know. You don't know it either, at least not consciously. This name gives you power, but it would also give other people absolute power over you. If someone knew it, they could command your loyalty, your love, everything about you. Your free will could be totally eradicated, which is why we keep our true names hidden.
So, what's the third name?
The name you take. It can't be used against you. It can't be used to influence you, and it's your first defense against a sorcerer's attack. Your taken name seals your given name, protects it, and that's why it's so important to get it right.
So Skulduggery is the name you took?
It is.
What about me? Should I have a third name?
He hesitated for only a moment. If you're going to be accompanying me on this, then yes, you probably should.
And am I going to be accompanying you?
That depends. Do you need your parents' permission?
Stephanie's parents wanted her to find her own way in life. That's what they'd said countless times in the past. Of course, they'd been referring to school subjects and college applications and job prospects. Presumably at no stage did they factor living skeletons and magic underworlds into their considerations. If they had, their advice would probably have been very different. Stephanie shrugged.
No, not really.
But that's good enough for me.
They reached the car and got in, and as they pulled out onto the road, she looked at him. So who's this Serpine you were talking about?
Nefarian Serpine is one of the bad guys. I suppose now that Malevolent is gone, he'd be considered the bad guy.
What's so bad about him? The purr of the engine was all that filled the car for a few moments.
Serpine is an adept,
Skulduggery said at last.
He was Malevolent's most trusted lieutenant. You heard what China was saying about how she is a collector, how Gordon was a collector. Serpine is a collector too. He collects magic. He is tortured, maimed, and killed in order to learn other people's secrets. He's committed untold atrocities in order to uncover obscure rituals, searching for the one ritual that he and religious fanatics like him have been seeking for generations. Back when the war broke out, he had this weapon. These days, he's full of surprises, but he still uses it because, quite frankly, there's no defense against it.
What's the weapon?
To put it simply, agonizing death.
Agonizing death? On its own? Not like fired from a gun or anything?
He just has to point his red right hand at you and, well, like I said, agonizing death. It's a necromancy technique.
Necromancy?
Death magic. A particularly dangerous, adept discipline. I don't know how he learned it, but learn it he did.
And what does the Scepter thing have to do with all this?
Nothing. It has nothing to do with anything.
Well, what is it?
It's a weapon of unstoppable destructive power. Or it would be if it actually existed. It's a rod, about the length of your thigh bone. Actually, I think I might have a picture of it.
He pulled the car over and got out to open the Bentley's boot. Stephanie had never been to this part of town before. The streets were quiet and empty. She could see the bridge over the canal in the distance. Moments later, Skulduggery was back behind the wheel. They were driving again, and Stephanie had a leather-bound book on her lap. What's this? She asked, opening the clasp and flicking through the pages.
Our most popular myths and legends,
said Skulduggery.
You just passed the Scepter.
She flicked back and came to a reproduction of a painting of a wide-eyed man reaching for a golden staff with a black crystal embedded in its hilt. The scepter was glowing, and he was shielding his eyes. On the opposite page was another picture, this time of a man holding the scepter, surrounded by cowering figures, their heads turned away. Who's this guy?
He's an ancient. In the legends, they were the very first sorcerers, the first to wield the power of the elements, the first to use magic. They lived apart from the mortal world, had no interest in it. They had their own ways, their own customs, and their own gods. Eventually, they decided that they wanted to have their own destinies too, So they rose up against their gods, rather nasty beings called the Faceless Ones, and battled them on the land, in the skies, and in the oceans. The Faceless Ones, being immortal, won every battle, until the Ancients constructed a weapon powerful enough to drive them back. The Scepter.
You sound like you know the story well.
Tales around the campfire might seem quaint now, but it's all we had before movies. The Faceless Ones were banished, forced back to wherever they came from.
So, what's happening here? He's killing his gods?
Yep. The Scepter was fueled by the Ancients' desire to be free. That was the most powerful force they had at their disposal.
So it's a force for freedom?
Originally. However, once the Ancients no longer had the Faceless Ones to tell them what to do, they started fighting among themselves, and they turned the Scepter on each other and fueled it with hate.
The streetlights played on his skull as they passed in and out of darkness, flashing bone white in hypnotic rhythm.
The last Ancient, he continued, having driven his gods away, having killed all his friends and all his family, realized what he had done and hurled the Scepter deep into the earth, where the ground swallowed it.
What did he do then?
Probably went for a snooze. I don't know, it's a legend, it's an allegory, it didn't really happen.
So why does Serpine think it's real?
Now, that is puzzling. Like his master before him, he believes some of our darker myths are more disturbing legends. He believes the world was a better place when the Faceless Ones were in charge. They didn't exactly approve of humanity, you see, and they demanded worship.
The ritual that he's been looking for, is it to bring them back?
It is indeed.
So he might think that the Scepter, which drove them away, could somehow call them home, right?
People believe all kinds of things when it comes to their religion.
Do you believe in any of it? The Ancients? Faceless Ones? Any of it?
I believe in me, Stephanie, and that's enough for now.
So could the Scepter be real?
Highly unlikely.
So what does any of this have to do with my uncle?
I don't know, Skulduggery admitted. That's why they call it a mystery.
Light filled the car, and suddenly the world was bucking. The only sounds, a terrifying crash and the shriek of metal on metal. Stephanie lurched against her seatbelt and slammed her head against the window. The street outside tilted wildly, and she realized the Bentley was flipping over. She heard Skulduggery curse beside her, and for an instant she was weightless, and then the Bentley hit the ground again and jarred her against the dashboard. It rocked back into its tires. Stephanie looked at her knees, her eyes wide but her brain too stunned to think. "Look up," said a faint voice in her head. "Look up to see what's happening." The Bentley was still, its engine cut out. But there was another engine, a car door opening and closing. "Look up." Footsteps, running footsteps. "Look up now." Skulduggery beside her, not moving. "Look up, there's someone coming for you. Look up now." A window exploded beside her for the second time that night, and the man from the house was grabbing her and hauling her out of the car. His clothes were ragged and charred, but his skin had been untouched by the fireball that had enveloped him at Gordon's house. She glimpsed his face as she was dragged through the yellow light of the Bentley's headlamps, a face that was twisted in anger and hatred. And then she was lifted and slammed onto the bonnet of the car that had hit them. His hands had her collar bunched, his knuckles digging into her throat.
"You will die," he hissed. "Right here and now, if you do not give me that damned key."
Her hands were on his, trying to break his grip. Her head felt light, blood pounding in her temples.
"Please,"
she whispered, trying to breathe.
"You're going to make me look bad,"
the man growled.
"My master is going to think I'm a fool if I can't get one stupid little key of one stupid little girl."
The street was empty around them. Shop fronts and businesses closed for the night. No one was going to hear her. No one was coming to help her. Where was Skulduggery? The man lifted her off the bonnet and slammed her down again. Stephanie cried out in pain, and the man leaned in, his right forearm pressed beneath her chin.
"I'll snap your scrawny neck," he hissed.
"I don't know anything about a key," Stephanie gasped.
"If you don't know anything, you're of no use to me, and I'll kill you here,
She looked up at that horribly twisted face and stopped trying to pull his hands away. Instead, she dug her thumb into the bullet hole in his shoulder. He screamed and let her go and staggered back, cursing, and Stephanie rolled off the car and ran to the Bentley. Skulduggery was pounding at the door, but it had buckled under the impact, trapping his leg.
Go!
He shouted at her through the broken window.
Get away!
Stephanie glanced back, saw a figure loom up and pushed herself away from the car. She slipped on the wet road but scrambled to her feet and ran, the man right behind her clutching his injured shoulder. He lunged and she ducked, caught a streetlight and swung herself from her course, and the man shot by her and sprawled onto the pavement. She took off the opposite way, passing the two cars and running on. The street was too long, too wide, and there was nowhere she could lose him. She turned off into a narrow lane and sprinted into the shadows. She heard him behind her, heard the footsteps that seemed to be moving much more quickly than her own. She didn't dare look back. She didn't want the fear that was lending her speed to suddenly sabotage her escape. It was too dark to make out anything ahead of her. She couldn't see one arm's length ahead. She could be about to run smack into a wall, and she wouldn't... Wall... Stephanie twisted at the last moment and got her hands up and hit the wall, then pushed away, kicking off without losing too much momentum, continuing around the corner. The man couldn't see in the dark any better than she could, and she heard him hit the wall and yell out a curse. Up ahead was a break in the darkness. She saw a taxi pass. The man slipped and stumbled behind her. She was getting away. All she had to do was run up to the nearest person she could find, and the man wouldn't dare follow her. Stephanie plunged out of the shadows and screamed for help, but the taxi was gone and the street was empty. She screamed again, this time in desperation. The street lights tinted everything orange and stretched her shadow out before her. Then there was another shadow moving up behind, and she threw herself to one side as the man barreled past, narrowly missing her. The canal was ahead, the canal that flowed through the city. She ran for it, aware that the man was once again behind her and gaining fast. She felt his fingers on her shoulder. The first touch was fleeting, but the second was a grip. His hand curled around her shoulder and tightened just as she reached the edge of the canal, and she managed to throw herself forward before he could drag her back. She heard a panicked shriek from behind and realized she had pulled him after her. Then the freezing water enveloped them both. The cold stunned her for a moment, but Stephanie fought it and kicked out. She clutched at water and dragged it down to her sides, just like she had done countless times off the haggard beach. Now she was moving up to where the lights were. She broke the surface with a gasp and turned her head, saw the man struggling, flailing his arms in terror. For a moment she thought he couldn't swim, but it was more than that. The water was hurting him, working through him like acid, stripping pieces of him away. His cries became mere guttural sounds, and Stephanie watched as he came apart and was silent and most dead. She turned from the bits of him that floated to her and ploughed through the water. Her hands and feet were already numb with the cold, but she kept going until the bridge was far behind. Shivering, Stephanie reached the edge of the canal and managed to haul herself out. Arms crossed over her chest, trainers squelching with every step, and her hair plastered to her scalp, she hurried back to the Bentley. When she got there, the Bentley was empty. Stephanie hung back out of the light. A truck passed, slowing when it approached the crash. When the driver didn't see anyone, he drove on. Stephanie didn't move from her spot. A few minutes later, Skulduggery emerged from the narrow lane she'd been chased down. He was walking quickly, looking up and down the street as he returned to his car. Stephanie stepped out of the shadows. "Hey!" she said.
Stephanie!
Skulduggery exclaimed, rushing over to her.
You're all right?
I went for a swim,
she said, trying to stop her teeth from chattering.
What happened?
He asked.
Where is he?
Here and there.
The light breeze was passing through her soaking garments.
The water kind of took him apart.
Skulduggery nodded. It happens. He held out his hand, and she felt herself drying, and saw the water drifting off her, collecting as mist in the air over her head.
You're not surprised?
She asked. He moved the cloud away and released it. A faint shower fell to the street. Certain types of adept magic don't come cheap. As we saw at Gordon's house, your attacker had made himself impervious to fire and was probably very proud of himself for doing so. Unfortunately for him, the cost of that little spell was that a large amount of water would be lethal. Every big spell has a hidden snag.
He clicked his fingers and conjured fire, and Stephanie started to feel warm again. "Neat trick," she said. "You'll have to teach me it sometime." With quite a bit of effort, Stephanie pulled open the car door. She wiped the broken glass from the seat and got in, buckling the seatbelt. Skulduggery went around the other side to his own broken window and climbed in behind the wheel. He twisted the key and the engine turned, complained, and then came to life. Her body was tired. Her mind was tired. Her limbs felt heavy and her eyes wanted to close. She dug her mobile phone out of her pocket. Miraculously, the canal water hadn't ruined it. She pressed a button and the time flashed up, and she groaned, then looked outside as the first light of the morning started to seep into the sky.
"What's wrong?"
Skulduggery asked.
"Are you hurt?"
"No," she said. "But I will be if I don't get back to Gordon's house. Mum will be picking me up soon."
"You don't look too happy."
"Well, I don't want to go back to that world. A boring old town with nosy neighbors and nasty aunts."
"You'd rather stay in a world where you get attacked twice in one night."
"I know it sounds crazy, but yes, things happen here."
"I'm going to see a friend later today. Someone who might be able to help us out. You can come along if you want."
"Really?"
"I think you might have a real feel for this line of work."
Stephanie nodded and gave a little shrug, and when she spoke she fought hard to keep the sheer joy out of her voice. "And what about magic?"
"What about it?"
"Will you teach me?"
"You don't even know if you're capable of doing magic."
"How do I find out? Is there a test or something?"
"Yes. We cut off your head. If it grows back, you can do magic."
"You're being funny again, aren't you?"
"So glad you noticed."
"So will you teach me?"
"I'm not a teacher. I'm a detective. I already have a career."
"Oh, right. It's just, I'd really like to learn, and you know it all."
"Your flattery is subtle."
"But it's okay. If you don't want to teach me, that's okay. I suppose I could always ask China."
Skulduggery looked at her. "China won't teach you. She won't teach you because there is nothing that she does that is not for her own gain. You mightn't see it at first. You might think she's actually being nice to you, but you can never trust her."
"Okay then."
"Okay, so we're agreed."
"We're agreed, no trusting China."
"Good. Glad we've got that sorted."
"So will you teach me magic?"
He sighed. "Dealing with you is going to be a trial, isn't it?"
"That's what my teachers at school say."
"This is going to be fun,"
Skulduggery said dryly.
"I just know it."
Skulduggery dropped Stephanie off at Gordon's house, and half an hour later her mother's car splashed through huge puddles and Stephanie went outside to meet her. She managed to keep her mother's attention off the house, lest she noticed that the front door was merely leaning against the doorframe. "Good morning," her mother said as Stephanie got in the car. "Everything okay?" Stephanie nodded. "Yeah, everything's fine. You're looking a little bedraggled." "Oh, thanks, Mum." Her mother laughed as they drove back towards the gate. "Sorry. So tell me, how was your night?" Stephanie hesitated, then shrugged. "Uneventful." Nefarian Serpine had a visitor. The hollow men bowed deeply as he strode through the corridors of his castle. They looked real from a distance, but up close they were nothing more than cheap imitations of life. Their papery skin was a mere expressionless shell, inflated from within by the foulest of gases. It was only their hands and feet that were solid and heavy. Their feet clumped when they walked, and their hands weighed down their arms, so they stood with a perpetual stoop. Their number increased the closer he got to the main hall. They were simple creatures, but they did what they were told, and they hadn't known what to make of the visitor. Serpine entered the main hall. The crowd of hollow men parted, and a man in a dark suit turned to him.
"Mr. Bliss,"
Serpine said politely.
"I thought you were dead."
"I heard that too,"
Bliss responded. He was an elegant man of muscle and mass, as tall as Serpine, but whereas Serpine had black hair and glittering emerald green eyes, Bliss was bald, with eyes of the palest blue.
"In fact, It was a rumor I started. I thought it might make people leave me alone in my retirement.
And has it?
Unfortunately, no.
Serpine motioned for the hollow men to leave them, and then led his guest into the drawing room. "Can I get you a drink?" Serpine asked, heading to the liquor cabinet. "Or is it too early in the day?"
I'm here on business,
Bliss said.
elder business.
Serpine turned, gave him a smile. "And how are the elders?"
Worried.
"When are they not?" Serpine went to the armchair by the window, watched the sun as it struggled to rise, then settled into the chair, crossed his legs, and waited for Bliss to continue. The last time they had been in the same room together, they had been trying to kill each other while a hurricane tore the place down around them. The very fact that Bliss remained standing right now told Serpine that he was thinking the same thing. Bliss was wary of him.
The elders called me in because 5 days ago 2 of their people went missing. Clement Gale and Alexander Slake.
How very unfortunate. But I don't believe I've ever had the pleasure of meeting either of them.
They were assigned to observe you from time to time.
Spies?
Not at all. Merely observers. The elders thought it prudent to keep tabs on a few of Mevelyn's followers, to make sure no one strayed from the terms of the truce. You were always at the top of that list.
Serpine smiled. And you think I had something to do with their disappearance? I'm a man of peace these days, not war. I seek only knowledge.
You seek secrets.
You make that sound so sinister, Mr. Bliss. As for the missing observers, maybe they'll turn up safe and well, and the elders can apologize for dragging you out of your retirement.
They turned up yesterday.
Oh?
Dead.
How terrible for them.
Not a mark on their bodies. No indication at all as to how they died. Sound familiar?
Serpine thought for a moment, then arched an eyebrow and held up his gloved right hand. You think this did it? You think I killed those men? I haven't used this power in years. When I first learned it, I thought it was a wonderful thing, but now I look on it as a curse, and a reminder to me of my many mistakes and transgressions in my servitude to Mevelyn. I don't mind telling you, Mr. Bliss, that I am deeply ashamed of what I have done with my life. Bliss stood there, and Serpine almost spoiled it all by laughing, but he managed to retain his look of mocking innocence.
Thank you for your cooperation,
Bliss said, turning to leave.
I shall be in touch if I need to ask you more questions.
Serpine waited until Bliss was at the door before speaking again. They must be scared. Bliss stopped.
What makes you say that?
They sent you, didn't they? Why didn't they send the detective, I wonder?
Skulduggery Pleasant is busy with another investigation.
Is that so? Or maybe they thought I would be intimidated by you.
They thought you'd listen to me. This truce will hold only for as long as both sides want it to. The elders want it to hold.
That must be nice for them. Mr. Bliss looked at him like he was trying to read his thoughts.
Be careful, Nefarian. You might not like what's at the end of this road you're on.
Serpine smiled. You're sure you won't join me for a drink?
I have a plane to catch.
Going somewhere nice?
I have a meeting in London.
I hope that goes well for you. We'll have a drink some other time then.
Perhaps.
Mr. Bliss inclined his head in a small bow and left. Stephanie went to bed as soon as she got home and woke at a few minutes past 2 in the afternoon. She padded to the bathroom and showered, her body aching as she stood under the spray. Her knees were scraped and cut from when she'd been dragged along the road. Her skin was mottled with deep bruises. Her neck was stiff. She turned off the water and stepped out of the shower, dried herself off and pulled on fresh jeans and a t-shirt. Barefoot, she took her old clothes downstairs and threw them in the washing machine, added the powder and turned it on. It was only after she'd had something to eat that she allowed herself to think about the previous night. Well, she said to herself, so that happened. She pulled on her shoes and went out, the sunshine warm on her face. At the end of her road, she passed the old pier and started towards Main Street. Normality. Kids playing football, riding bikes and laughing, dogs running about, tails wagging, neighbours talking to neighbours, and the world being as she'd always thought it was. No living skeletons, no magic, no men trying to kill her. A crazy laugh escaped her lips when she reflected on how much her life had changed in the space of a day. She'd gone from being a perfectly ordinary girl in a perfectly ordinary world to becoming a target for water-soluble weirdos and a partner for a skeleton detective out to solve her uncle's murder. Stephanie faltered. Her uncle's murder? Where'd she got that from? Gordon had died of natural causes. The doctors had said so. She frowned. But these were doctors who lived in a world without walking, talking skeletons. But still, why assume he'd been murdered? What on earth had made her think that?
There are items that cannot be taken, China had said. Possessions that cannot be stolen. In such a case, the owner must be dead before anyone else can take advantage of its powers.
Her attacker, and whoever had sent him, wanted something. They wanted something badly enough to kill her to get it. And if they wanted it that badly, would they really have waited for her uncle to die of natural causes before they went looking for it? Stephanie felt cold. Gordon had been murdered. Someone had killed him, and no one was doing anything about it. No one was asking the questions. No one was trying to figure out who did it. Except for Skulduggery. She narrowed her eyes. He must have known Gordon was murdered. If he hadn't already suspected it when they first met, he must have worked it out in the library. China probably knew as well. But neither of them had told her. They didn't think she could handle it, maybe. Or maybe they didn't think it was any of her business. It had to do with their world after all, not hers. But Gordon was still her uncle. A car pulled up behind her. People stared. She looked back and saw the Bentley. The driver's side was still badly buckled from where the car had rammed it, and the windscreen was cracked. 3 of the windows were without glass, and the bonnet had a series of ugly dents running up its left side. The usual purr of the engine was replaced by a worrying rattle that cut out abruptly when the engine turned off. Skulduggery, in hat, scarf and sunglasses, went to get out, but the door wouldn't open. "Oh boy," Stephanie muttered. She watched him lean away from the door and raise his knee, and then he kicked it open and got out, adjusting his coat as he walked over. "Good afternoon," he said brightly. "Wonderful weather we're having, isn't it?" "People are staring," Stephanie whispered as he neared. "Are they really? Oh, so they are. Good for them. So, are we ready to go?" "That depends," she answered, speaking softly and keeping a smile on her face. "When were you going to tell me that my uncle was murdered?" There was a slight hesitation. "Ah, you worked that out then." Stephanie turned down a narrow lane between 2 buildings, moving away from the prying eyes of Haggard's gossip-mongers. Skulduggery hesitated a moment, then caught up to her, walking fast. "I had a very good reason for not telling you." "I don't care." Now that no one could see her, she dropped the smile. "Gordon was murdered, Skulduggery. How could you not have told me?" "This is a dangerous business. It's a dangerous world that I'm part of." She stopped suddenly. Skulduggery kept walking, realized she wasn't beside him anymore, and turned on his heel. She crossed her arms. "If you don't think I can handle it—" "No, you certainly proved yourself capable." She heard the tone of his voice change slightly. "I knew from the moment I met you that you're just the type of person who would never walk away from danger, simply out of stubbornness. I wanted to keep you out of it as much as I could. You've got to understand, Gordon was my friend. I thought I owed it to him to try and keep his favorite niece out of harm's way." "Well, I'm in harm's way, so it's not your decision anymore." "No, apparently it isn't." "So you won't keep anything from me again?" He put his hand to his chest. "Cross my heart and hope to die." "Okay." He nodded and led the way back to the Bentley. "Though you don't actually have a heart," she said. "I know." "And technically, you've already died." "I know that too." "Just so we're clear." "What's he like?" Stephanie asked as they drove. "What's who like?" This guy we're going to see, what's his name? Ghastly bespoke. She looked at Skulduggery to make sure he wasn't joking, then realized there was no way she could tell. Why would anyone call themselves Ghastly? All manner of names suit all manner of people. Ghastly is my tailor, and also happens to be one of my closest friends. He first taught me how to box. So what's he like? Decent, honorable, honest, but more fun than I'm making him sound, I swear. Also, he's not magic's biggest fan. He doesn't like magic? How could he not like magic? He just doesn't find it interesting. He prefers the world he reads about in books and sees on TV, the world with cops and robbers and dramas and sports. If he had to choose, I expect he'd live in the world without magic. That way he could have gone to school and got a job and been normal. Of course, he's never been given the choice. I suppose for him, there could never really be a choice. Not really. Why not? Skulduggery hesitated for only a moment, as if he was choosing how best to say it, then told her that Ghastly was born ugly. Not just unattractive, he said. Not merely unappealing, but really, honestly ugly. His mother was jinxed when she was pregnant with him, and now his face is ridged with scars. They tried everything to fix it, spells, potions, charms, glamours, various and sundry creams, but nothing worked. He explained that as a child, Ghastly had always told his friends that he got his love of boxing from his father and his love of sewing from his mother. The truth was, his father was the one who was constantly making alterations to hemlines and such, and his mother was a bare-knuckle boxing champ who boasted 22 consecutive wins. Skulduggery had seen her fight once. She had a right hook that could take a head clean off, and according to legend, it had once too. Regardless, Ghastly was brought up in these two separate disciplines, and figuring he was ugly enough already, decided to try a career as a tailor rather than a boxer. And I, for one, am glad he did, Skulduggery said. He makes extraordinary suits. So we're going to see him because you need a new suit? Not quite. You see, his family has amassed a unique collection of artwork, paintings, and literature about the ancients from all over the world. Included are a couple of rare volumes that could be very useful indeed. All anyone knows about the Scepter is based on half-forgotten myths. Those books, and whatever else is in Ghastly's collection, will hold a far more detailed description of the legends, about what the Scepter does, and, in theory, how one would go about defending oneself against it. They parked and got out. The neighborhood was dirty and run down, and people hurried by without even glancing at the battered car in their midst. A little old lady shuffled past, nodding to Skulduggery as she went. Is this one of those secret communities you were telling me about? Stephanie asked. Indeed it is. We try to keep the streets as uninviting as possible, so no casual passerby will stop and have a look around. Well, you've succeeded. You should be realizing by now that looks are, more often than not, deceiving. A neighborhood like this, with its graffiti and litter and squalor, is the safest neighborhood you could possibly visit. Open the door to any one of these houses around us and you walk into a veritable palace. Surface is nothing, Stephanie. I'll try to remember that, she said, as she followed him to a little shop perched on the corner. She looked around for a sign. Is this the tailor's? Bespoke tailors, yes. But there's no sign. There aren't any clothes in the window. How would anyone know it's even open? Ghastly doesn't need to advertise. He has a very specific clientele, and he can't really afford to let ordinary people wander in when he's measuring out a new suit for an 8-armed octopus man. Are you serious? There's an 8-armed octopus man? There's a whole colony of octopus people, Skulduggery said as they approached the door. Really? Good God, Stephanie, of course not. That would be far too silly. He walked on before she could even try to hit him. The shop door was unlocked and he led the way in. Stephanie was surprised by how clean and bright and ordinary looking it was. She didn't know what she was expecting. Mannequins that came alive and tried to eat you, perhaps? There was a nice smell in here too. Comforting. Ghastly Bespoke walked out from the back room, and when he saw them he smiled. He shook Skulduggery's hand warmly. He was broad-shouldered, and his scars covered his whole head. When Skulduggery turned to introduce Stephanie, and he saw the way she was staring at Ghastly, he shrugged. "Don't mind her," he said. "She stares. That's what she does when she meets new people."
I'm quite used to it.
Ghastly said, still smiling.
Do you want to shake hands, miss, or start off with something easy, like waving?
Stephanie felt herself blush, and she stuck out her hand quickly. His hand was normal, no scars, but tough and strong.
Do you have a name?
He asked. Not yet, she admitted.
Better make sure that you really want one before you think any more about it. This life isn't for everyone.
She nodded slowly, not sure what he was getting at. He took a moment, looking her up and down.
There's been some trouble.
Some, answered Skulduggery.
Then the proper attire is probably called for.
Ghastly took out a small pad, started jotting down notes.
Do you have a favorite color?
He asked her. I'm sorry?
To wear. Any preference?
I'm not sure I understand.
Not all of the clothes I make are merely examples of exquisite tailoring. Sometimes, if the situation arises, special requirements are catered for.
Such as keeping you safe until this whole thing is over, Skulduggery said. Ghastly can make you a suit, nothing too formal, which could very possibly save your life.
Fashion,
said Ghastly with a shrug.
It's life or death.
His pen was at the ready.
So, once more, do you have a favorite color to wear?
I'm not sure I could afford it. Ghastly shrugged.
I'll put it on Skulduggery's tab. Go nuts.
Stephanie blinked. To go from her mother buying most of her clothes to this was a step she hadn't been expecting. I don't know. I'm not sure. Black? Ghastly nodded and scribbled in his notebook.
Can't go wrong with black.
He looked up at Skulduggery.
Just let me lock up,
he said.
Then we can talk properly.
While they waited for him to do so, Skulduggery and Stephanie wandered into the back of the shop. Material and fabrics of all types and textures were arranged very neatly in massive shelves that lined the walls. There was a single workplace in the center of the room, and another doorway leading further back. He's going to make me clothes, Stephanie whispered. Yes, he is. Doesn't he need to take measurements or something? One glance, that's all he needs. They passed through into a small living room, and moments later Ghastly joined them. Stephanie and Skulduggery sat on a narrow sofa, and Ghastly sat in the armchair opposite, both feet flat on the ground and fingers steepled.
So, what's all this about?
He asked. We're investigating Gordon Edgley's murder, Skulduggery said.
Murder?
Ghastly said after a short pause. Indeed.
Who would want to kill Gordon?
We think Serpine did it. We think he was looking for something.
Skull,
Ghastly said, frowning.
Usually when you want my help, you just call and we go off and you get me into a fight. You've never explained what's going on before, so why are you doing it now?
This is a different type of help I need.
So you don't need me to hit anyone?
We'd just like your help in finding out what Serpine is after.
I see,
Ghastly said, nodding his head. You don't see, do you?
No,
Ghastly said immediately.
I really don't know what you want me to do.
We think Serpine is after the Scepter of the Ancients, Stephanie said, and she felt Skulduggery sink lower into the cushion beside her.
The what?
Ghastly said, his smile reappearing.
You're not serious, are you? Listen, I don't know what my dear friend here has been saying, but the Scepter isn't real.
Serpine thinks it's real. We think that has something to do with my uncle's death.
I'm sorry for your loss,
Ghastly said.
I really am. I respected Gordon. He knew there was magic in the world and he wasn't seduced by it. He just wanted to observe and to write about it. That takes a strength that I hope has been passed on to you.
Stephanie didn't answer. Skulduggery didn't look at her.
But,
Ghastly continued,
to say that his death has something to do with a legend that has been passed down from generation to generation, and that has changed with each telling is just nonsense. He had a heart attack. He was mortal. He died. That's what mortals do. Let him have his death.
I think my uncle knew where the scepter is, or he had it and Serpine killed him, and now Serpine knows where it is, and that's why he wants the key.
What key?
The key to get the scepter, maybe. We're not sure. What we do know is that he tried to kill me twice to get it. Ghastly shook his head.
This isn't your world.
I'm a part of it now.
You've just stepped into it. You've seen magic and sorcerers, and a living skeleton, and I bet you're having great fun. But you haven't the slightest idea what's at stake.
Skulduggery didn't say anything. Stephanie got to her feet. You know what? She said. For me, this is an adventure. That's what you're saying, isn't it? Well, you're right. I do look at all this as a big adventure, and I'm fascinated and excited and thrilled by it all. I've seen amazing people do amazing things, and I've been amazed. Her eyes hardened. But don't you dare, for 1 second, think that this is just a game to me. My uncle left me a fortune. He left me everything I could ever want. He did all that for me, but he's dead now. So now I'm going to do something for him. I'm going to find out who killed him, and I'm going to do what I can to make sure they don't just walk away from it. He's got to have someone on his side.
This is insane,
Ghastly said, leaning forward in his chair.
The Scepter's a fairy tale.
I believe it exists.
Of course you believe it exists. You've been dragged into a world where you think anything can happen, but that's not how it works. Your uncle involved himself in this, and if what you say is true, he got killed for it. Are you so eager to do the same? You're playing with fire.
Everyone plays with fire around here.
This hasn't gone the way I was expecting, Skulduggery said.
There are rules for things like this,
Ghastly said, ignoring her and speaking to Skulduggery.
There's a reason we don't tell everyone we're out there. She is a prime example of why.
Stephanie's anger flared, and she knew she couldn't talk now without her voice cracking and betraying her. So she dashed past Ghastly. She walked through the shop, unlocked the door, and walked out onto the street. She could feel the anger twisting in her insides, making her fingers curl. She hated not being treated as an equal, she hated being talked down to, and she hated the feeling of being protected. She didn't much like to be ignored either. Skulduggery emerged from the shop a few minutes later, hat back on. He walked up to her as she leaned against the Bentley, arms crossed and staring at a crack in the pavement.
So, that went well, he said eventually.
When she didn't answer, he nodded and said,
Did I tell you how I first met Ghastly?
I don't want to know.
Ah, all right then.
Silence drifted down like smog.
It's not very interesting anyway, but it has pirates in it.
I couldn't care less, Stephanie said. Is he going to help us or not?
Well, he doesn't think it's a great idea to have, to have you with me on this one.
Oh, really? Stephanie responded bitterly.
He seems to think I'm being irresponsible.
And what do you think?
I have been known to be irresponsible in the past. It's entirely plausible that it's happening again.
Do you think I'm in danger?
Oh, yes. Serpine still believes you are in possession of whatever key he's looking for. The moment he learns who you are or where you are, he'll send someone else. You're in, and I don't think I'm exaggerating here, especially grave danger.
Then let's be absolutely clear on this, okay? I can't leave this. I can't go back to my dull, boring, ordinary life, even if I wanted to. I've seen too much. I'm involved here. It's my uncle who was murdered. It's my life that was in danger, and I'm not about to just walk away. That's all there is to it.
Well, I'm convinced.
So why are we standing around?
My question exactly,
Skulduggery said, unlocking the Bentley. They got in, and the Bentley rattled to life at the turn of the key. Skulduggery checked the rear view, then the wing mirrors, then remembered that he didn't have any wing mirrors anymore, and pulled out onto the road. So we don't get to look at his family's collection? Stephanie asked as they drove.
Ghastly is a good man, and a good friend, and precisely the kind of person you want on your side, but he's also one of the most stubborn people I know. In 4 days, once he has had time to think, he will change his mind, and he will quite happily let us see what we need to see, but until then we don't have a hope.
Wouldn't the books be in China's library too?
Skulduggery made a noise halfway between a laugh and a grunt. China has been after those books for years, but they're locked away where even she can't reach them.
You know where they are?
In the vault.
In a vault? So what?
Not a vault, the vault. It's a series of chambers housed beneath the Dublin Municipal Art Gallery, very well protected, where they don't take kindly to trespassers.
Stephanie took a moment and spoke. Ghastly will change his mind in 4 days.
That's how long it usually takes, yes.
But we don't have 4 days, do we?
No, we don't.
So, you know what we have to do, right?
Unfortunately, yes.
We need to look at that collection.
Skulduggery looked at her. I knew you'd be good at this. The moment I saw you, I knew you had an instinct for this job.
So we break into the vault?
He nodded reluctantly. We break into the vault. The Dublin Municipal Art Gallery was situated in one of the more affluent parts of the city. A gleaming triumph of steel and glass, it stood alone and proud, its lush gardens keeping the other buildings at a respectable distance. Stephanie and Skulduggery parked across the road as part of what Skulduggery was calling a preliminary stakeout. They weren't going to break into the vault yet, he assured her. They were just here to get some idea of what they were up against. They had just seen the gallery staff and a half-dozen security guards leave the building, their shift over for the day. 2 people, a man and a woman, dressed in blue overalls, passed them on the steps and entered the gallery, locking the doors behind them. Skulduggery said from beneath his scarf. We may have a problem.
What problem?
Stephanie asked.
Them? Who are they?
The night shift.
2 people? That's all?
They're not exactly people.
So who are they?
It's not so much who as what.
I swear, Skulduggery, you either give me a straight answer, or I'm finding the biggest dog you've ever seen, and I'm going to make him dig a hole and bury you in it.
Oh, that's charming, that is, Skulduggery said, then made a sound like he was clearing his throat, though there was nothing to clear and no actual throat to clear it from. Did you notice the way they moved?
Very, I don't know, gracefully. What about it? Are they dancers? The vault has ballerina security guards?
They're vampires, Skulduggery said. The vault has vampire security guards. Stephanie made a show of poking her head out of the window and looking up at the sky. The sun's still out, Skulduggery. It's still bright. Doesn't matter to them.
She frowned. Doesn't sunlight kill them? Doesn't it turn them to dust or make them burst into flames or something?
Nope. Vampires tan, just like you and me. Well, just like you. I tend to bleach.
So sunlight has no effect on them?
It binds them. It dampens their powers. During the day, they are for all intents and purposes mortal. But when the sun goes down, their powers flare up.
I didn't know that.
And the vault employs 2 of them as their night shift, the ultimate guard dogs.
If sunlight doesn't hurt them, I don't suppose crosses will scare them off.
The best way to stop a vampire is with a whole lot of bullets, and since we don't want to hurt anyone, this is that problem I was telling you about.
There must be a way to get by them. We could disguise ourselves as cleaning staff or something.
No one works when vampires are around. Vampires don't make a distinction between allies and prey. They can't resist the bloodlust any more than a moth can resist a big, bright light. They're killers, the most efficient, deadly killers on the face of the planet.
Scary.
Yes, well, vampires aren't known for being cute.
Well then, we're going to have to come up with something really, really clever.
Skulduggery paused, then shrugged. I suppose I am good at that. Skulduggery took Stephanie home, and as she was lying in bed that night, finally drifting off to sleep, a young woman in London was hunkering down and peering into the darkness.
"Hello?" she said. "Anyone down there?"
The Thames was dark and rushing beneath her, but no one answered. She glanced at her watch and looked around. It was 7 minutes to midnight, and Westminster Bridge was empty except for her. Perfect.
"Hello?" she said again. "I need to talk to you."
A voice answered.
There's no one down here.
"I think there is,"
She said.
No,
Came the voice.
no one.
"I think there's a troll down there,
The young woman said.
and I need to talk to him."
A face rose up out of the shadows, small and wrinkled, with large ears and a shock of spiky black hair. Huge eyes blinked at her.
What do you want?
The troll asked.
"I want to talk to you."
The young woman answered.
"I'm Tanith Lowe. What's your name?"
The troll shook his head.
No, not telling that.
"Oh, yes,"
Tanith said.
trolls only have one name, isn't that right?
Yes, one name, no telling.
But I can guess, isn't that how it goes? If I guess your name correctly, what happens then?"
The troll grinned, showing lots of sharp yellow teeth.
You get to live.
He said.
"And if I get it wrong?"
The troll giggled.
You get eaten.
"That sounds like a fun game,"
Tanith said with a smile.
"What time do you usually play?"
Midnight, stroke of midnight, yes, when I'm strong.
"And you pop out from under there at whoever's passing, don't you?"
3 chances.
The troll said, nodding.
3 chances is what they get. Guess the name, don't get eaten, get it wrong, come along.
"Do you want to play it with me?"
The grin faded on the troll's face.
Not strong yet, need to wait, yes, stroke of midnight.
"We don't have to wait, do we?"
Tanith said with a pout.
"I want to play now. I bet I can guess your name."
No, you can't.
"Bet I can."
No, you can't.
The troll said, giggling again.
"Come on up out of there, we'll see."
Yes, play the game.
Tanith glanced at her watch and stepped back as the troll scampered up. 2 minutes to midnight. He was small, up to her waist, with thin arms and legs and a bloated belly. His fingernails were hardened and pointed, and he was grinning in anticipation, though keeping his distance. She let her coat fall open a little and smiled at him.
"You're a handsome little fellow, aren't you? Are you the only troll in London?"
Only one.
He said proudly.
Now we play. Guess the name, don't get eaten, get it wrong, come along. Guess.
"Let's see,"
She said, taking a step closer. The troll narrowed its eyes and stepped back towards the edge of the bridge. She stopped moving.
"Is your name Bollow Hollow?"
The troll roared with laughter.
No, not Blow Hollow. 2 guesses left, only 2.
"This is harder than I thought," said Tanith. "You're really good at this, aren't you?
Best, very best.
Not many people have guessed your name, huh?"
No one.
The troll cackled.
Guess.
"Is it Burninabop Kapuki?"
The troll whooped and hollered and danced, and Tanith moved a little closer.
Not for Ninabop.
He laughed.
Not Kapruki.
Wow, Tanith said, looking worried.
"I'm not doing too well here, am I?"
Gonna get eaten.
"You eat a lot of passers-by?"
Yes, yum.
"You gobble them all up, don't you? They scream and cry and run away."
But I catch them.
The troll giggled.
Stroke of midnight, I'm big and strong and fast. Gobble them up, gobble them all up. They struggle and wriggle and tickle inside me.
"I'd better get my last guess right then, hey?"
Said Tanith.
"Is it Rumpelstiltskin?"
The troll laughed so hard he fell on his back.
No!
He managed to say between gales of laughter.
They always say that, always get it wrong.
Tanith took one more step and dropped her smile. The sword flashed from her coat, but the troll saw it just in time and squealed and rolled. Tanith cursed and swiped again, but the troll dodged beneath her, and she spun and kicked out, sending him sprawling. He scrambled to his feet, hissing and spitting at her as she advanced, and then, in the warm London night, the sound of Big Ben. Midnight. Tanith lunged, but it was too late. The troll skipped back as his shoulders hunched, and he snarled and started to grow.
Nuts.
Tanith whispered to herself. Muscles bulged in his arms and legs, stretching the skin so tight it looked like it might split. She moved forward again, but he flipped back through the air, and when he landed he was as tall as she was. His chest broadened, and his neck thickened, and still he grew, and still he snarled. His bones popped, and he finished growing. He was now almost twice her size. Facing down a fully grown troll was not what she had planned. She held the sword down by her leg and circled the creature.
You cheated,
the troll said, his voice deep and guttural now. You've been a very naughty boy, she said.
Gobble you up, gobble you all up, yes, yes.
Tanith shot him a smile. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. The troll roared and lunged, moving fast despite his size, but Tanith was ready. She slipped to the side and then past him, her sword opening up his thigh. He hissed in pain and swung a massive fist that slammed into her back. She hit the ground hard. He went to stamp on her, but she rolled, coming up on one knee and bringing the sword from her side to her shoulder, and the blade found his arm. The troll stumbled back, and she got to her feet.
Gonna bite you,
the troll growled.
Gonna bite you into little pieces, yes, yes.
The game's not so much fun when you're playing with someone who can fight back, is it?
My bridge,
he snarled.
My game.
She smiled at him. My rules. Another roar, and he dived straight at her, and she stood her ground. One swipe of the sword took the fingers on his left hand, and he howled in pain and staggered back, and she jumped. She planted her feet on his chest and swung, the blade flashing in the bridge's lights as it took his head. The troll's body stumbled back, and she jumped off. The body hit the barrier and tipped backwards into the river. Tanith stooped to pick up the head and moved to the barrier. She turned as a man walked up. She'd never met him before, but she knew who he was. He was tall and bald, and his face was lined, and his eyes were a startling blue, the palest eyes she had ever seen. His name was Mr. Bliss. Mr. Bliss nodded to the head in her hand.
Risky.
I fought trolls before, she said respectfully.
I meant the risk you took with being seen.
It had to be done. This troll has killed many innocent people.
But that's what trolls do. You can't blame him for doing what nature intended.
She didn't know how to respond. Mr. Bliss smiled.
I'm not berating you,
he said.
You've done a noble and selfless thing that is to be admired.
Thank you.
You puzzle me, however. I've been keeping an eye on your progress over the last few years. It is unusual to find a mage, even an adept like you, focusing as heavily on physical conflict as you have done. Yet you don't seek power.
I just want to help people.
And that is what puzzles me.
My mother used to tell me stories about the war, she said. I think you may be forgetting some selfless acts of your own. Mr. Bliss smiled softly.
There is no heroism in war. There are simply things that need to be done. The heroes come later. But I am not here to discuss philosophies.
He looked at her with his startling blue eyes.
The storm is brewing, Miss Lowe. Coming events will threaten to turn the tide of power in this world, and so I have left my place of solitude and come here searching for you. I have a need for someone of your ability and your outlook.
I'm not sure I understand.
The sorcerer Serpine is about to break the truce. If I fail in my endeavors, we will once again slip into war. I need you on our side.
It would be an honor, Tanith said.
We have much to learn from each other,
Mr. Bliss responded, bowing.
Make your way to Ireland, he said, and I will be in touch with you soon.
She nodded, and he walked away. Tanith threw the troll's head into the Thames, and hiding her sword under her coat, walked off in the other direction. Stephanie was woken the next morning by the stereo playing very loudly indeed. Her dad had been trying to tune into a news station and the volume knob had snapped off, so instead of a quiet little traffic report, they were treated to Wagner's The Ride of the Valkyries at full blast. He'd lost the remote control down the back of the sofa and hadn't the first clue how to turn the stereo off. The music reverberated through the floor and on the walls. There was no escaping its sheer power. By the time her mother had yanked the plug out of the socket, Stephanie was wide awake. Her mother poked her head in to say goodbye, and as her parents went off to work, Stephanie threw on a pair of jeans and a t-shirt. While she waited for Skulduggery to arrive, she thought about what would be a good name for her to take. Skulduggery had explained how the actual taking of a new name casts a seal around the old one. So if Stephanie took the name Crystal Hammer, she didn't plan on it, then the name Stephanie Edgley would be instantly immune to any controlling spells. But while she only went by her given name, she was vulnerable. If she were to have a new name, it would have to be a name she wouldn't be embarrassed about in years to come. It would have to be something classy, and also something she felt comfortable with. Skulduggery had told her about people who'd taken names like Razor and Phoenix, and how he wouldn't advise anyone to take a name that seemed cool. He'd once been introduced to a woman who had put on a little weight over the years, and her hair had been a bit windswept, and she had spinach in her teeth, and he was told her name was Jet. Jet did not suit this woman, the same way Razor did not suit the short fat man who took that as a name. Stephanie looked up from her desk as Skulduggery knocked on the window. She opened it.
"I thought girls were supposed to be tidy,"
he said as he peered in. Stephanie kicked some underwear under her bed and ignored the comment. "You okay out there?"
"I've been perched on worse roofs, believe me."
"My parents have gone to work, you know. You could have used the door."
"Doors are for people with no imagination."
"Are you sure no one saw you? The last thing I need is for a neighbour to be passing and see you climbing up the side of the house."
"I was careful, don't you worry. And I have something for you."
He gave her a short piece of chalk. Thank you," she said slowly.
"Go to your mirror."
"I'm sorry?"
"Go to your mirror and draw this symbol on it."
He handed her a small card that showed an eye in a circle with a wavy line through it. "What's this for?"
"It's to help you. Go on."
She frowned, then went to the mirror.
"No,"
Skulduggery said.
"A full-length mirror. Do you have one?"
"Yeah," Stephanie said. Still with no clue why she was doing this, she opened her wardrobe and used the chalk to copy the symbol onto the mirror on the other side of the door. When she was done, she handed the card and the chalk back to Skulduggery. He thanked her, put them away, and then looked at the mirror.
"Surface speak, surface feel, surface think, surface real."
He looked at her again.
"Could you wipe the symbol off now, please?"
"What is going on? What are you doing? Did you just cast a spell on my mirror?"
"Yes, could you wipe the symbol off?"
"Well, what does the spell do?" she asked as she used her sleeve to erase the chalk.
"You'll see,"
he answered.
"Are you wearing a watch?"
"My watch broke. I wore it swimming. I thought it was waterproof."
"Was it?"
"As it turned out, no. Why do you need to know the time?"
"Oh, I don't. Touch the mirror."
She narrowed her eyes. "Why?"
"Touch it."
Stephanie hesitated, then did as he said, and reached out, touching her fingers lightly against the mirror. But when she pulled back, her reflection did not. She watched in amazement as her reflection blinked, as if awakening from a trance, then dropped its arm to its side and looked around. Then, very slowly, it stepped out through the mirror. "Oh my God!" Stephanie said, moving back as the reflection joined her in the room. "Oh my God!" she said again, because she couldn't think of anything else to say. Skulduggery looked on from the window.
"It will carry on with your life while you're away, so you won't be missed."
Stephanie stared. "She's me!"
"Not she, it. And it isn't you, it's a surface copy. It walks like you, talks like you, behaves like you, and it should be enough to fool your parents and anyone else it comes into contact with. When you return, it goes back into the mirror, and the experiences and the memories it has made transfer to you."
So I can be in two places at once?"
"Precisely. It can't spend too long in other people's company, or they'll start to notice that things aren't quite right, and it would never fool a mage, but it is ideal for your needs."
"Wow!" Stephanie peered closer at the reflection. "Say something." The reflection looked back at her. "What do you want me to say?" Stephanie laughed suddenly, then clapped a hand over her mouth. "You sound just like me! she said through her fingers.
I know. Do you have a name? My name is Stephanie. No, a name of your own.
Skulduggery shook his head. Remember, it's not a real person. It has no thoughts or feelings of its own. They're all imitations of yours. It's your reflection, that's all it is. Operating instructions are as follows. It cannot change out of the clothes you're wearing when you cast it, so make sure you're not wearing anything with a logo or insignia. They'll come out backwards. Make sure you're not wearing a watch or a ring. They'll appear on the opposite hand. Apart from that, it's pretty simple.
Wow.
We should go.
She turned to him, frowning. Are you sure they won't realize it's not me?
It'll stay out of other people's way for most of the time and try to avoid any long conversations. Even if your parents corner it and bombard it with questions, they'll just think you're acting strange.
Stephanie chewed her lip, then shrugged. I suppose jumping to the conclusion that it's my reflection come to life is a bit unlikely.
You'd be surprised by how many things we get away with that fall into the category of unlikely. You ready to go?
I suppose I am.
Do you want to leave by door or window?
Doors are for people with no imagination.
Stephanie grinned and joined Skulduggery on the windowsill. She took one look back. The reflection was standing in the middle of the room, perfectly still.
Bye,
Stephanie said.
Bye,
the reflection responded, and tried to smile for the first time. It looked kind of eerie. Stephanie climbed out and hung on to Skulduggery as he jumped, displacing the air beneath them to act as a cushion. They landed gently and made it to the end of the road without any neighbour seeing them. But when they reached the pier, Stephanie's face fell. She stared in horror as Skulduggery marched onwards.
What the hell is that? She demanded.
It's my car, Skulduggery answered, leaning against it with his arms folded. The sea breeze ruffled his wig beneath his hat. She stared at him, at the car, and then at him again.
What happened to the Bentley?
She asked. His head tilted. I don't know if you noticed, but it was ever so slightly dinged.
And where is it now?
It's getting fixed.
Right, that's a good answer. Fixed is a good answer, but I don't know. I'm kind of drawn back to my original question. What the hell is that?
Skulduggery was leaning against a canary yellow hatchback with lime green seat covers. It's my replacement car, he said proudly.
It's hideous!
I don't mind it, actually.
Well, you're wearing a disguise, so no one will recognize you anyway.
That may have something to do with it.
When will the Bentley be fixed?
That's the nice thing about living in a world of magic and wonder. Even our most extreme car repairs happen in less than a week.
Stephanie glared at him.
A week? Not a week, he said quickly. 6 days. Sometimes 5. Definitely 4. I'll call him, tell him I'll pay the extra. She was still glaring. Day after tomorrow, he said quietly. Her shoulders sagged.
Do we really have to ride around in this?
Think of it as an adventure, he said brightly.
Why should I do that?
Because if you don't, you'll just become really, really depressed. Trust me, now hop in. Skulduggery hopped in. Stephanie dragged her feet around to the other side and more kind of fell in. She squirmed down in the lime green seat as much as she could as they drove through Haggard. There was a parcel in the back seat, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Beside that was a black bag.
Is that the gear for breaking into the vault? She asked. Is that where we're going?
Well, to answer your first question first, yes. That bag contains all the equipment needed for a beautifully executed break-in. To answer your second question, no, that is not where we're going. Before I get to introduce you to a life of crime, I get to introduce you to the Elder Mages.
Crime sounds more fun.
As indeed it is, though I would never condone crime in any of its forms. Except when I do it, naturally.
Naturally. So why are we delaying the fun? What do these Elder Mages want?
They've heard that I've been dragging a perfectly nice young lady into all manner of trouble, and they want to admonish me for it.
Tell them it's none of their business.
Well, while I do admire your moxie...
What's moxie?
I'm afraid that won't work too well with these fellows. One thing you have to remember about the Elder Mages is that they're...
Really old sorcerers?
Well, yes.
Worked that out all by myself.
You must be so proud.
Why'd you have to report to them? Do you work for them?
In a way. The Elders pass the laws, and they have people who enforce the laws. But there are only a few of us who actually investigate the breaking of those laws. Murders, robberies, a couple of kidnappings, the usual. And while I may be freelance, most of my work, and my money, comes from the Elders.
So, if they want to wag their fingers at you,
I have to stand there and be wagged at.
So why do they want me to be there? Aren't I the innocent young girl being led astray?
See, I don't really want them to view you as the innocent young girl. I want them to view you as the rebellious, insubordinate, troublesome tearaway who has made herself my partner. Then maybe they'll take pity on me.
Wait, do they even know I'm coming with you?
No, but they like surprises. Almost always.
Maybe I should wait in the car.
In this car?
Ah, good point.
Stephanie, we both know something serious is going on, but as yet the Elders have refused to consider that their precious truce might be in jeopardy.
And why would they believe me, and not you?
Because I go to them loaded with baggage. I have a history, and, some might say, an agenda. Besides, tales of horror are always more effective coming from a lady.
I'm no lady.
He shrugged. You're the closest I've got.
Skulduggery had another surprise for her as they drove. He pulled into a fast food place and nodded to the parcel in the back seat. "What's that?" she asked.
What do you think it is?
"It looks like a parcel."
Then that's what it is.
"But what's inside it?"
If I tell you, I deprive the parcel of its whole reason to be. She sighed.
"And what is its reason to be?"
To be opened, of course, and to reveal what it's holding.
"You are so annoying," Stephanie muttered, reaching back and taking the parcel. It was soft to the touch. She looked at Skulduggery. "The clothes?"
I'm saying nothing.
"Ghastly made the clothes already? I didn't think he was going to make them at all, not after, the argument." Skulduggery shrugged and started humming. Stephanie sighed, then took the parcel. She got out of the yellow car and walked into the fast food restaurant, making her way to the toilets at the back. Once secured inside a cubicle, she pulled open the string and the parcel unfolded before her. It was the clothes. They were the deepest black, made of a material she had never seen before. She got changed quickly, noting how perfectly everything fitted, and stepped out of the cubicle to admire herself in the mirror. The trousers and the tunic, a sleeveless garment with silver clasps, were pretty good by themselves, and the boots fitted as though she'd been wearing them for years. But it was the coat that completed the picture. 3/4 length, shaped especially for her, made of a material so black it nearly shimmered. She resisted the temptation to leave her other clothes in the toilet, and instead wrapped them in the brown paper and left the restaurant.
Surprise,
Skulduggery said, when she was back in the canary car.
It's the clothes.
She looked at him. "You are so weird." 20 minutes later, they were walking into the Waxworks Museum. The building was old, in dire need of repair, and the street wasn't much better. Stephanie didn't say a word as they paid and went wandering through the dark corridors, surrounded on both sides by imitation celebrities and fictional characters. She'd been here 2 or 3 times as part of school trips when she was younger, but couldn't see the point of visiting now. They hung back from a small group of tourists until they were certain they were alone, and only then did Stephanie say anything. "What are we doing here?"
"We're here to visit the Elders' Sanctuary,"
Skulduggery replied. "And are the Elders made of wax?"
"I like coming here," he said, taking off his sunglasses and ignoring her question. "It's very liberating."
He took off his hat and wig and pulled the scarf from his neck. Stephanie looked around nervously. "Aren't you afraid someone might see?"
"Not in the slightest."
"Well, maybe we should go and talk to the Elders then."
"Good idea."
Skulduggery moved to one side of the corridor and traced his hand over the wall.
"Where is it?"
he muttered.
"Bloody idiots keep changing it." The tourist came back around the corner, and Stephanie went to drag Skulduggery out of sight, but it was too late. They had already seen him. A small American boy left his parents' side and walked right up to him. Skulduggery was frozen to the spot.
"Who's that meant to be?"
The boy asked, frowning slightly. Stephanie hesitated. Now the entire tour was looking at her, including the tour guide. "This is," Stephanie said, racking her brains for a likely-sounding explanation. "This is Sammy Skeleton, the world's worst detective." "Never heard of him," the boy said, giving Skulduggery's arm a poke. He shrugged and lost interest, and Stephanie watched the tourists carry on. When they were out of sight, Skulduggery swiveled his head to her. "World's worst detective?" he asked. She shrugged and hid her grin, and Skulduggery harumphed good-naturedly and went back to running his hand along the wall. He found what he was looking for and pressed inwards. A section of the wall slid open to reveal a hidden passage. "Wow," Stephanie said. "The sanctuary's here? I used to come here when I was little."
Never knowing that beneath your feet was a world of magic and wonder.
"Exactly." He tilted his head slightly.
Better get used to that feeling.
She followed him in, and the walls sealed shut behind them. The stairway downwards was lit by torches that flickered in their brackets, but the closer they got to wherever it was they were going, the brighter it became. They emerged into the gleaming foyer of the sanctuary. It would have reminded Stephanie of the lobby to a high-tech company building, all marble and varnished wood paneling, were it not for the lack of windows. Two men stood guard against the far wall, hands clasped behind them, dressed entirely in grey, with long coats and some sort of helmet with a visor that covered their entire faces. They each had a scythe, a wicked-looking blade on a 1.5-metre staff strapped to their backs. A slight man in a suit came out to greet them.
"Detective?"
he said.
"You are early. The council is not ready to convene. I could show you to the waiting area if you wish."
"Actually, I might take the opportunity to show our guest around, if that's all right." The man blinked.
"I'm afraid access is strictly limited, as well you know."
"I was just going to show my friend the repository," Skulduggery said. "The book, in fact."
"I see. Well, as administrator of the sanctuary, I would have to accompany you, naturally."
"Wouldn't have it any other way." The administrator bowed and spun on his heel and led them down an adjoining corridor. They passed more people in grey uniforms as they walked. Stephanie was getting used to dealing with people with no eyes and no expressions, but there was something about them that unnerved her. Skulduggery, living skeleton though he was still fundamentally human, and yet these people, who merely wore helmets to hide their faces, seemed to her much more sinister.
Who are they?
Stephanie whispered as they walked.
Cleavers, Skulduggery replied in a low voice. Security guards, enforcers, and army rolled into one. Dangerous individuals. Be glad they're on our side.
She did her best not to look at them as they passed. "Where are we going?" she asked, trying to change the subject.
I'm taking you to see the Book of Names, Skulduggery said. Some say it was created by the ancients, but the truth is no one knows who really made it or how it was made. It lists the names of every person living on this earth. The given name, the taken name, when and if a name is taken, and the true name. Every time a baby is born, a new name appears in its pages. Every time someone dies, their name fades away.
Stephanie looked at him. "So my true name is in that book?"
As is mine, as is everyone's.
"Isn't that dangerous? If someone got their hands on that, they'd be able to rule the world." She let a few moments pass. "And I felt ridiculous even saying that." The administrator glanced over his shoulder as he walked.
"Not even the elders open the book. It is too powerful. It can corrupt too easily. But they can't find a way to destroy it. It can't be torn, it can't be burnt, it can't be damaged by any means we have at our disposal. If the legends are true and the book was created by the ancients, then it stands to reason that only the ancients could destroy it. The elders, for their part, see it as their responsibility to protect it, to keep it away from prying eyes."
They reached a set of double doors. The administrator waved his hand, and the heavy doors swung slowly open. They walked into the repository, a large room with marble pillars, which, as Skulduggery explained, housed some of the rarest and most unusual magical artifacts in existence. They passed row upon row of shelves and tables on which lay items so bizarre they defied description. The administrator pointed out one of the strangest of these, a two-dimensional box that held wonders to sate the most jaded of appetites, but which only existed if approached from a right angle. In contrast to this clutter, however, was the center of the room, which was empty, save for a pedestal. And on that pedestal, a book.
That's the Book of Names,
Stephanie asked.
Yes, it is,
the administrator answered.
I thought it'd be bigger.
It's as big as it needs to be, no more, no less.
And it's okay to leave it out in the open like that?
It's not as vulnerable as you might think. When it was placed here, the security arrangements did cause the elders some concern. How would it be protected? Guards can be overcome. A locked door can be unlocked. A wall can be broken. A shield can be pierced.
So, what? They decided not to bother?
Actually, they came up with the most ingenious defense. Willpower.
Sorry?
The book is protected by the will of the elders.
Stephanie wasn't sure if he was joking or not.
See for yourself,
the administrator said.
Take the book.
Me?
You won't be harmed.
Stephanie glanced at Skulduggery, but he gave no indication as to what she should do. Finally, she just turned and started walking towards it. Her eyes darted from one side of the room to the next. She thought about trapdoors and immediately started examining the floor she walked on. What form did willpower take? She hoped it wasn't bullets or anything painful like that. She was mildly annoyed that she was even doing this, walking right into whatever trap the elders had set up, and doing so willingly. For what? To prove a point that wasn't even hers? She didn't even want to take the book. This whole thing was ridiculous. She glanced back, saw the administrator standing there with a placid expression on his face, obviously anticipating whatever was about to happen, whatever was going to pop out in front of her to stop her from taking their precious book. She stopped walking. If he wanted the book, he could get it himself. She turned and walked right back again. The administrator peered at her.
You didn't take it,
he said. Stephanie forced herself to remain polite.
No, I didn't. But I'll take your word for it that it's well protected.
When you started walking, you wanted to take the book, yes?
I suppose so.
And why didn't you?
Because I changed my mind.
Because you didn't want to take it anymore.
Well, yes, so?
That is the will of the elders. No matter how badly you want that book in your hands, the closer you get, the less you want it. It doesn't matter if you want it for yourself, if you want it because you were ordered to take it, or because your very life depends on it. With every step you take, your indifference towards the book increases, no matter who you may be or what power you may have. Even Meritorious himself couldn't get close to it.
Stephanie looked at him, taking it all in. Finally, she had to say it. There was no way she couldn't.
That's very impressive.
It is, isn't it?
The administrator turned his head a little, as if hearing something.
The council is ready for you now. Please come this way.
They walked into an oval-shaped room and stood facing a large door. There was only one light source, from somewhere overhead, and the edges of the room remained in relative darkness.
The elders will be but a moment,
the administrator said, and walked quietly away. They always do this, Skulduggery said. Keep people waiting.
My headmaster does the same thing whenever someone's called to his office. He thinks it makes him look important.
Does it work?
Makes him look late.
The door ahead opened and an old man entered. He had short white hair and a tightly cropped beard, and he was tall, taller than Skulduggery. He wore a suit the colour of granite, and as he walked, Stephanie became aware of the shadows to his right. They seemed to shift and stretch alongside him, and she watched as more of them reached over from the corners of the room to join the mass. The shadows suddenly rose up from the floor and melted into an elderly woman in black. She fell into step beside the tall man, and their footsteps slowed as they neared. A third person faded up from nothing, materialized right out of thin air on the other side of the tall man. He looked a little younger than the others, and he wore a sky-blue suit, the jacket of which was struggling to contain his hefty paunch. Stephanie looked at the elder mages, and the elder mages looked at Stephanie.
"Skulduggery,"
the tall man said eventually, his voice deep and resonant.
"Trouble follows in your wake, doesn't it?"
"I wouldn't say follows," Skulduggery answered. "It more kind of sits around and waits for me to get there." The man shook his head.
"This is your new partner, then?"
"Indeed it is," Skulduggery answered.
"No taken name?"
"No."
"That's something, at least."
The man shifted his focus to Stephanie.
"I am Ethan Meritorious, Grand Mage of this council. Beside me are Morwenna Crow and Sagacious Tome. Can I assume, because you have not yet picked a name, that you do not intend to involve yourself in our affairs for very much longer?"
Stephanie's throat was dry. "I'm not sure."
"See?"
Skulduggery said.
"Insubordinate. You have been placed in dangerous situations,"
Meritorious continued.
"Surely you would prefer to go back to the safety of your normal life."
"What's so safe about it?"
Ah,
Skulduggery chimed in.
rebellious.
"I mean," Stephanie continued, "I could get knocked down crossing the road tomorrow. I could get mugged tonight. I could get sick next week. It's not safe anywhere." Meritorious raised an eyebrow.
"While this is true, in your normal life, you never had to deal with sorcerers and murder attempts."
The elders were gazing at her with interest. "Maybe," she admitted. "But I don't think I could just forget about all this." Skulduggery shook his head sadly. "Troublesome." The woman, Morwenna Crow, took over.
Detective, you have petitioned the council on numerous occasions concerning a supposed threat to the truce.
"I have."
And as yet you have failed to produce evidence.
"This girl standing beside me is my evidence," Skulduggery said. "Twice she has been attacked, and twice her attacker has been after a key."
What key?
asked Sagacious Tome. Skulduggery hesitated.
Mr. Pleasant?
"I believe the attacker's master to be Serpine."
What key, Detective?
"If Serpine is ordering attacks on civilians, this is a clear breach of the truce, and the council has no choice but to—"
The key, Mr. Pleasant. What does it open?
Stephanie glanced at Skulduggery's inscrutable visage, and thought she could detect hints of frustration in the small movements he was making. "I believe the key will lead Serpine to the recovery of the Scepter of the Ancients."
"I never know when you're joking, Skulduggery,"
Meritorious said, starting to smile. "I hear that a lot."
"You are aware that the scepter is a fable?"
"I am aware that it is thought to be, yes. But I am also aware that Serpine has been working on tracking it down, and I believe Gordon Edgley may have had it."
Nefarian Serpine is now an ally,
said Sagacious Tome.
We live in a time of peace.
"We live in a time of fear," Skulduggery said,
where we're too scared of upsetting the status quo to ask the questions we need to be asking.
"Skulduggery,"
Meritorious said.
"we all know what Serpine did. We all know the atrocities he has committed in the name of his master Malevolent and for his own gains. But for as long as the truce holds, we cannot act against him without good cause. He has ordered the attacks on my companion. You have no proof. He murdered Gordon Edgley, but you have no proof. He's after the Scepter, which doesn't even exist."
Meritorious shook his head sadly.
"I am sorry, Skulduggery, there is nothing we can do."
"As for the girl," said Morwenna, "we had hoped her involvement in all this would be minimal." "She's not going to tell anyone," Skulduggery said quietly.
Maybe so. But if she takes one more step deeper into our world, it may be impossible for her to step out again. We want you to consider this carefully, Detective. Consider what it would mean.
Skulduggery gave a slight nod of acknowledgement but said nothing.
"Thank you for agreeing to meet us,"
Meritorious said.
"You may leave."
Skulduggery turned and walked out, Stephanie right behind him. The administrator hurried over.
"I know the way out,"
Skulduggery growled, and the administrator backed off. They passed the cleavers, standing as still as the wax models above them, and climbed the staircase out of the sanctuary. Skulduggery donned his disguise, and they walked back to the canary car in silence. They had almost reached it when he stopped and turned his head. "What's wrong?" Stephanie asked. He didn't answer. She couldn't see anything beneath his disguise. Stephanie looked around, paranoid. It appeared to be a normal street, populated by normal people doing normal things. Granted, the street had potholes and the people were scruffy, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. And then she saw him. A tall man, broad and bald, his age impossible to gauge. He walked towards them like he'd all the time in the world, and Stephanie stood by Skulduggery and waited.
"Mr. Pleasant,"
the man said when he had reached them. "Mr. Bliss," Skulduggery responded. Stephanie looked at this man. He radiated power. His pale blue eyes settled on her.
"And you must be the girl who attracts all sorts of attention."
Stephanie couldn't speak. She didn't know what she would have said, but she did know that her voice would have been thin and reedy if she tried. There was something about Mr. Bliss that made her want to curl up and cry. "I haven't seen you in a while," Skulduggery said. "I heard you'd retired." There was something peaceful about Mr. Bliss's eyes, but it wasn't the calming kind of peaceful. It wasn't a peaceful that comforted you and made you feel safe. It was another kind of peaceful, the kind that promised you no more pain, no more joy, no more anything. Looking at him was like looking into a void with no beginning and no ending. Oblivion.
"The elders asked me to return,"
Mr. Bliss said.
"These are troubling times after all."
"Is that so?"
"The two men who had Serpine under surveillance were found dead a few days ago. He's up to something. Something he doesn't want the elders to know about."
Skulduggery paused. "Why didn't Meritorious tell me this?"
"The truce is a house of cards, Mr. Pleasant. If it is disturbed, it will all come down. And you are known for your disturbances. The elders hoped my involvement would be enough of a deterrent, but I fear they have underestimated Serpine's ambition. They refuse to believe that anyone would benefit from war. And of course, they still think the Scepter of the Ancients is a fairy tale."
Skulduggery's voice changed, but only slightly.
"You think the Scepter's real?" "Oh, I know it is. Whether it can do everything the legends claim, that I do not know. But as an object, the Scepter is quite real. It was uncovered during a recent archaeological dig. As I understand it, Gordon Edgley had been searching for the Scepter for some time, as part of his research for a book about the Faceless Ones, and he paid a substantial amount of money to gain possession of it. I imagine he worked to verify its authenticity, and once he had done so, he realized he couldn't keep it, nor could he pass it on. Gordon Edgley, for all his faults, was a good man, and if there was a chance that it did have the destructive capabilities we've all heard about, he would have felt that the Scepter was too powerful for anyone to possess."
"Do you know what he did with it?" Stephanie asked, finding her voice at last.
"I don't."
"But you think Serpine's willing to risk war?" Skulduggery asked. Mr. Bliss nodded.
"I think he views the truce as having outlived its usefulness, yes. I imagine he has been waiting for this moment for quite some time, when he can seize all the power and plunder every secret and invite the Faceless Ones back into the world."
"You believe in the Faceless Ones?" Stephanie asked.
"I do. I grew up with those teachings, and I have carried my faith through to this day. Some dismiss them. Some view them as morality tales. Some view them as stories to tell children at night. But I believe that once we were ruled by beings so evil, even their own shadows shied away from them. And I believe they have been waiting to come back to punish us for our transgressions."
Skulduggery cocked his head. "The elders would listen to you."
"They are bound by the rules. I have learned what I can, and I have passed it on to the only person who would know what to do with it. What you do next is up to you."
"With you on our side," Skulduggery said, "things would be a lot easier." A small smile appeared on Mr. Bliss's face.
"If I have to act, I will."
Without even a good day, Mr. Bliss turned and walked away. They stayed where they were for a few moments, then got in the canary car, and Skulduggery pulled away from the curb. They drove for a bit before Stephanie spoke.
He's kind of scary.
"That happens when you rarely smile. Mr. Bliss is physically the most powerful individual on the face of the planet. His strength is beyond legendary."
So he is scary?
"Oh yes, very much so." He drove on and settled into silence. Stephanie let a few moments drift by.
What are you thinking?
Skulduggery gave a small shrug. Lots of clever little things.
So do you believe that the Scepter is real?
It certainly looks that way.
I suppose this is a big deal for you, huh? Finding out that your gods really existed?
But we don't know that. If the Scepter is real, its true history could have been mixed up with the legends. Its existence does not prove that it was used to drive away the faceless ones.
Funny. I wouldn't have thought that a living skeleton would be such a skeptic. So what's our next move?
Skulduggery was silent for a bit. Right, well, we've got to work out what we need. We've got to work out what we need, how we get it, and what we need to get what we need.
I think I actually understood that,
Stephanie said slowly. The car went over a bump.
No, it's gone again.
We need the elders to take action, so we need proof that Serpine has broken the truce. We need to find the Scepter, and we also need to find out how to destroy the Scepter.
Okay, so how do we do the first one?
We'll get the proof once we find the Scepter.
And how do we find the Scepter?
We find the key.
And how do we destroy the Scepter?
Ah, he said. That'll be the little bit of crime that we'll have to embark on.
Crime?
Stephanie said with a smile.
Finally!
From their vantage point, parked across the road, they watched the vampires, once again in their blue overalls, walk up the steps and enter the gleaming art gallery. They were chatting and didn't look intimidating at all. A few minutes later, the staff and day shift security started to trickle out of the building. When every one of them was accounted for, Skulduggery reached into the back seat and pulled the black bag into his lap.
We're going now?
Stephanie asked, looking up into the evening sky.
But it's still bright.
And that's precisely why we're going now, he said. 20 minutes from now, there'll be 2 fully fledged vampires prowling around in there. I want to get in, find out how to destroy the Scepter, and get out before that happens.
Ah, probably wise.
Very probably. They got out of the horrible canary car and crossed the street, left the pavement and moved through the garden area to a tall tree behind the gallery. Making sure they wouldn't be seen, Skulduggery put the bag over his shoulder and started to climb. Stephanie jumped for the lowest branch, grabbed it, and started climbing up after him. She hadn't done anything like this in years, but climbing a tree was like falling out of one. Easy. The tree's limbs were long and strong, and they quickly came adjacent to the gallery's roof, which was ridged with a dozen skylights. Stephanie hoisted herself up on a branch and sat there, regarding the large gap between building and tree with curiosity. It looked too far to jump.
You sure I can't come with you?
Stephanie asked. I need you out here in case something goes terribly, terribly wrong.
Like what?
Oh, any one of a number of things.
Fills me with confidence, that,
she muttered. Skulduggery maneuvered himself onto the longest branch and then walked along it, bent-legged and stooped over. His balance was unnatural, but there was still that gap. Without pausing, he sprang forward off the branch. He brought his arms up by his sides and out in front, and a tremendous gust of wind buffeted him over to the rooftop. Stephanie promised herself that one day she'd get him to teach her how to do that. Skulduggery looked back. The gallery is outfitted with the most elaborate security systems, he said as he opened the bag. But because of the vampires, the alarms on the outer corridors are never set, so once I get by the main hall, it should be plain sailing, as they say.
As who say?
I don't know, people who sail, presumably.
He opened the bag and took out a harness that he started to strap himself into. He looked up at her. Where was I?
I have no idea.
Oh yes, my cunning plan. I need to access a control panel on the east wall. From there, I can disable everything. The floor is pressure sensitive, so I'm going to have to stay off it, but that shouldn't be a problem for someone of my natural grace and agility.
You're very impressed with yourself, aren't you?
Exceedingly so.
He secured a thin wire onto a ventilation duct, looped it through his harness, and led it back to one of the skylights. Stephanie frowned.
You're going to lower yourself down from here?
Yes, that's the fun bit.
Right. But you're going to have to open the skylight, yes? Won't that set off an alarm?
Only a small one,
Skulduggery said with confidence. She stared at him.
And wouldn't that be enough?
It's a silent little thing, hooked up to the nearby police station. Or it was hooked up. I passed by their transformer box before I collected you this morning. Oddly enough, it happened to short out at the exact same time. Something to do with a large amount of water mysteriously manifesting inside. I think they're baffled. They certainly looked baffled.
And your entire plan hinges on the hope that they haven't restored electricity yet?
Well, yes, he said, after a slight hesitation. But anyway,
he looked over at the setting sun, then back at Stephanie.
If you hear any screaming, he said, that'll be me.
He passed his hand over the lock, and it broke apart, then opened up one of the halves of the skylight and climbed over the side. She watched him disappear into it, and then heard a slight whirring as he used the handheld control to lower himself down in a harness. Stephanie sat back against the tree trunk, keeping an eye out for whatever she was supposed to be keeping an eye out for, anything unusual. She frowned to herself, not entirely certain of what constituted unusual anymore, and then she heard an unsettling scraping noise. She looked up. The wire Skulduggery had attached to the ventilation duct was slipping. She watched in horror as it slipped again, getting closer to the edge, closer to slipping off entirely. She thought of the pressure-sensitive floor, thought about Skulduggery crashing down and setting off every alarm in the place, and the vampires running in and catching him. Although he didn't have any blood for them to drink, she was sure they'd be able to find some other ways to punish the trespass. The wire slipped again, and Stephanie knew she didn't have a choice. She crawled along the same branch Skulduggery had jumped from, and it groaned beneath her weight. Skulduggery was nothing but bones, she reminded herself, in an effort not to feel fat. The gap was gaping. It was a gaping gap. Stephanie shook her head. She couldn't make it. There was no way she could jump that. With a decent run at it, she might have had a chance, but from crouching on the end of an unsteady branch. She closed her eyes, forcing the doubts from her mind. It wasn't a choice, she reminded herself. It wasn't a question of whether she could jump or would jump. Skulduggery needed her help, and he needed it now. So it was a question of when she did jump, what would happen then. So she jumped. She stretched out, and the ground moved far beneath her, and the edge of the building rushed at her, and then she started to dip. Her right hand thudded against the edge, and her fingers gripped. The rest of her body slammed into the side of the building, and she almost fell, but she shot her left hand up to join her right and held on. She pulled herself up, little by little, until she could get an arm over the edge, and soon she was safe. She had made it. The wire slipped again. It was about to snap from the duct, and then it'd all be over. Stephanie ran to it, got her fingers around the wire, and tried to tug it down again, but it was no use. She stood, put the sole of her boot against the wire, and used all her weight to try and push it down, but she didn't make the slightest bit of difference. She looked around for something to use, saw the bag, and snatched it up. Nothing inside but more wire. She grabbed the wire and dropped to her knees, tying a new piece to the wire already attached to the harness. Her father had taught her all about knots when she was little, and although she couldn't remember the names of most of them, she knew which knot suited this occasion. With the new length of wire added, she looked around for something to secure it to. There was another skylight right in front of her. She ran to it, wrapping the wire around the entire concrete base and getting it tied off just as the first piece of wire shot off the duct. There was a sudden snap as the wire went taut again, but it stayed secure. Stephanie hurried over to the open skylight and looked down. Skulduggery was hovering right above the floor, trying to stay horizontal after the sudden drop.
The motion control for the harness was still in his hand, but both arms were outstretched for maximum balance, and he couldn't move himself back up. There was a second control on the roof beside Stephanie, attached to the harness with a lead that twisted down through the skylight around the wire. Stephanie grabbed the control, jammed her finger against the up button, and Skulduggery started whirring upwards. When he was safe, he raised his head, saw her, and gave her the thumbs up. He took over the controls, positioning himself next to the wall, by the panel that he had already opened. Stephanie watched him flick a few switches, and then he spun himself gently. His feet touched the floor. No alarms went off. He undid the clasp on the harness and stepped out of it, then looked up. A moment passed, and he motioned for her to come down. Grinning, Stephanie recalled the harness, strapped herself in, climbed over the edge, and lowered herself down. Skulduggery helped her unclip it.
I suppose I could do with some backup,
he whispered, and she smiled. The gallery was big and spacious and white. There were huge glass sections in the walls. The main hall was full of paintings and sculptures, artfully arranged so it was neither cluttered nor sparse. They moved to the double doors and listened intently. Skulduggery opened one of the doors, checked outside, nodded to Stephanie. They crept out, closing the door behind them. She followed him through the wide corridors, around turns and through archways. She caught him glancing out of the windows as they passed. Night was coming. They got to a small alcove, away from the main hub of the gallery. Within this alcove was a heavy wooden door, crisscrossed by a grid of bolted steel. Skulduggery whispered for her to keep watch, and then hurried to the door, taking something from his pocket. Stephanie crouched where she was, peering into the ever-increasing gloom. She glanced back at Skulduggery as he worked at picking the lock. There was a window next to her. The sun had gone down. She heard footsteps and shrank back. The man in the blue overalls had appeared around the corner on the far side of the corridor opposite. He was walking slowly, like any security guard she'd seen in a mall. Casual, disinterested, bored. She felt Skulduggery sneak up behind her, but he didn't say anything. The man's hand went to his belly, and then he doubled over in pain. Stephanie wished she was closer. If he sprouted fangs, she'd hardly be able to see them from here. The man straightened up and arched his spine, and the sounds of his bones cracking echoed through the corridor. Then he reached up and grabbed his hair and pulled his skin off. Stephanie stifled a gasp. In one fluid movement he had pulled it all off. Hair, skin, clothes, and he was pale underneath, and bald, and his eyes were big and black. He moved like a cat, kicking off the remnants of his human form. She didn't have to be closer to see his fangs. They were big and jagged and hideous, and now she was quite content to be viewing them from a distance. These weren't the vampires she'd seen on TV. These weren't sexy people in long coats and sunglasses. These were animals. She felt Skulduggery's hand on her shoulder, and he pulled her back a fraction, very gently, just before the vampire looked over. It moved away from them, down the corridor, in search of prey. Stephanie followed Skulduggery to the door, and they passed through and closed it behind them. Skulduggery wasn't creeping anymore, but Stephanie didn't dare make a sound. He led the way down beneath the gallery, a flame in his hand lighting the steps. It was cold down here. They were in an old corridor now, with heavy doors on either side, and they walked until they came to a door with a crest etched into it, a shield and a bear. Skulduggery raised both hands and lowered his head and didn't move for almost a minute. Then the door clicked, and they stepped in. Skulduggery clicked his fingers, and candles flared up all around the chamber. There were books piled on books, and artifacts and statues and paintings and wood carvings, and there was even a suit of armor to one side.
This is all to do with the scepter,
Stephanie asked in a whisper.
It's all to do with the ancients,
Skulduggery answered.
So I'm sure there must be something about the scepter and all this. I honestly didn't expect there to be this much. You don't have to whisper, by the way.
There are vampires above us.
These chambers are sealed. I broke the locking seal, but the sound seal is still in place. Did you know locking seals have to be dismantled every single time you want to go through, and then crafted again once you leave? I don't see what's wrong with a good old-fashioned key. That would certainly keep someone like me out. Well, until I knocked the door down.
What
That's a sound seal,
Stephanie whispered. Oh, even if they were standing outside the door and you were shouting at the top of your voice, they wouldn't hear you.
Ah,
She said,
okay then.
but she still kept her voice low. They started searching. Some of the books were about the legends of the ancients, some took a more practical and analytical viewpoint, and some were written in a language Stephanie didn't recognize. A few of the books held nothing but blank pages, yet Skulduggery seemed able to read them, although he said they contained nothing of immediate interest. She started rooting through a collection of paintings, stacked in frames against the wall. A lot of them showed people holding the scepter aloft and looking heroic. The paintings toppled over, and she stooped to push them back up. She looked at the painting in front of her, recognizing it from the book she had seen in Skulduggery's car, a man shielding his eyes from a glowing scepter as he reached for it. This was the full painting, not the truncated little rectangle on a page. Skulduggery glanced over as Stephanie put the pictures back as she had found them. She approached the suit of armor, noting the shield and bear etched into the breastplate.
Family crest?
She asked. Sorry, Skulduggery said, looking up. Oh, yes, we don't have family names that we can keep, so crests serve as our only link to our ancestors.
Do you have a crest?
He hesitated. I used to. I don't anymore. She turned.
Why not?
I abandoned it, actually.
Why?
You ask an awful lot of questions.
When I grow up, I want to be a detective just like you.
He looked over and saw her grinning. He laughed. I suppose you do share my penchant for raising Cain.
Raising what now?
It's an old expression. It means to make trouble.
Well, why can't you say, make trouble? Why do you always have to use these words that I don't know?
You should read more.
I read enough. I should get out more.
Skulduggery held a small box up to the light, turning it over in his hands and examining it from every angle.
What's that?
She asked. It's a puzzle box.
Can't you play with it some other time?
The purpose of a puzzle box, its whole raison d'être, is to be solved.
What kind of raison?
Raison d'être. It's French for reason to be.
There you go again. Why didn't you just say reason to be? Why do you have to complicate things?
My point is, leaving a puzzle box unsolved is like leaving a song unsung. It may as well cease to exist.
There's a crossword in the paper my dad gets every single day. He starts it, ends up making up nonsensical words to fill in the blanks, and abandons it. I'll give you every paper we have lying about the house if you put that down and get back to searching.
I've given up searching. She stared at him.
And they say my generation has a short attention span.
That painting you were looking at. Notice anything strange about it?
There were a lot of paintings.
The man reaching for the scepter.
What about it?
Did you notice anything unusual about it?
Stephanie went over to the wall again, moved the frames one by one till she came to the painting he was talking about. Okay, unusual like how?
Describe it to me.
She moved the others out of the way so she could take a better look. There's this man. He's reaching for the scepter. It's glowing. And that's it.
Nothing strange about him?
No, not really. She frowned. Well...
Yes?
The scepter's really bright, and he's got one hand shielding his eyes, but both eyes are wide open.
So?
So, if it's really that bright, you'd kind of expect him to be squinting at least, even if it is just a picture?
Anything else strike you as a little off?
She scanned the painting. The shadows.
What about them?
He's got two of them.
So? The scepter is magical, remember? It could be casting two shadows as easy as one for whatever bizarre, magical reason.
But the scepter isn't casting these shadows, the angles are wrong.
So what would cause that?
Two different light sources?
And what is the primary source of light?
The sun?
If it is the sun, what time of day would it be?
Well, the shadow at his feet would make it noon, when the sun is directly overhead, but the shadow behind him would make it either morning or evening.
Which one?
How should I know? It's behind him, so it might be morning.
So what you're looking at is a painting of a man reaching for the scepter, seeing everything at a time when it is both the past and the present.
I suppose so.
What does this have to do with the puzzle box?
Who painted it? Stephanie peered at the bottom corner.
There's no name, only a crest. A leopard and crossed swords.
Skulduggery raised the puzzle box for her to see what was carved into its base. A leopard and crossed swords.
Right, she said, standing. Guessing games are over.
That painting tells us that the painter, or the painter's family, can offer us a glimpse into the past. And that is what we in the profession call a clue. A clue is part of a mystery. A mystery is a puzzle. I hold in my hands a puzzle box. Skulduggery's fingers played over the surface of the box, and Stephanie saw his head tilt. He pressed his hands against opposite sides, making subtle rotations until something clicked. There was a noise, like the whirring of a motorized part, and the top of the box opened to reveal a blue gemstone. "Ah," Skulduggery said. Stephanie peered closer. The gem was a little bigger than a golf ball.
What is it?
"It's an echo stone," he said. "Very rare. Generally it's used by people who are dying. They sleep with the stone close by for 3 nights, and in doing so they imprint it with their memories and personality. It's given to loved ones to help comfort them through their grief, or to answer any lingering questions they might have. Things like that."
How does it work?
"I'm not entirely sure," he said. "I've never seen one up close." He pressed a fingertip to the stone, and it immediately started to glow. His head tilted again, and he sounded very pleased with himself. "Would you look at that? I'm such a genius."
You just touched it.
"Still a genius, Stephanie," she sighed. A moment slipped by, and then an old man faded up from nothing before them. Stephanie stepped back.
Don't be alarmed,
the old man said, smiling. He was wearing a robe, and he had kind eyes.
I'm not going to hurt you, young lady. I'm here to answer questions and provide whatever information I can to assist you in your...
His voice trailed off. He was looking at Skulduggery.
My, oh my, you're a skeleton.
I am.
As I live and breathe, figuratively speaking, of course, as I neither live nor breathe, but a skeleton, a talking skeleton at that.
I am very impressive, Skulduggery said. Who are you?
My name is Oshin, and I am here to answer whatever questions you may have.
Well, that's good news, because we're looking for a few answers.
How did you manage that, then?
Oshin asked. I'm sorry?
Becoming a skeleton, that's a new one on me.
Well, it's a long story. Oshin waved his hand.
Better not tell me. This stone will only work for a short while before it needs to be charged. I don't have a lot of time to give you the answers you seek.
Then we'd better start.
Yes, we had better. Was it painful, though, losing your flesh?
I don't mean to be rude, Oshin, but aren't you the one supposed to be answering questions, not asking them? Oshin laughed.
I admit I'm a little too curious for my own good. On the other hand, I do have an in-depth knowledge of the stories of the ancients, so, in many ways, I'm the ideal candidate. Better suited to this than my colleagues, believe me. Before we get started, could I ask what century this is?
The 21st, Stephanie said.
21st!
He repeated, laughing with delight.
Oh my! So this is what the future looks like, eh? Kind of gloomy and cluttered. I always thought it'd be brighter, you know. So what's been happening in the world?
You want us to tell you everything you missed?
Well, not everything, just the high points. What language am I speaking, by the way?
Stephanie frowned.
English.
English, eh? Marvelous! I've never spoken English before. How does it sound?
Fine, I suppose. Does the stone translate what you're saying?
Yes, it does. I could have used something like this on my travels. I'll tell you that much. It would have really impressed the ladies.
He started to chuckle, then stopped.
Not that I travelled far, or at all. I don't trust boats, you see.
If nature had intended us to travel across water, we would have been provided with fins.
Can we ask you a question? Skulduggery asked. Again, I don't want to be rude, but if the stone runs out of power before we learn what we need... The old man clapped his hands and rubbed them together.
Of course, my boy. Say no more. Ask me your first question.
You're an expert on the ancients.
Yes, I am. I'm the one charged with the task of documenting their existence. It's a great honor, even if it does leave me with precious little time to travel. Not that I would, even if I could, but it'd be nice to have options, you know?
Yes, anyway, we need to know about the Scepter. We need to know its power. Oisin nodded.
The Scepter of the Ancients was created to destroy, and destroy it does. There is nothing that will not crumble to dust under its glare.
Is there any kind of defense against it? Oisin shook his head.
No shield, no spell, no barrier. It can't be stopped and it can't be destroyed.
What about its power source? Stephanie asked.
A single crystal, a black crystal, embedded in its hilt, capable of channeling the energy that's poured into it.
And can the crystal be destroyed? Oisin gave a little frown.
I've thought about this, actually. I know more about the Scepter than anyone else since the time of the Ancients. Certainly more than any of my colleagues. And while there is no record of a weakness, we have translations of texts that suggest the crystal can be destroyed from within.
How? Stephanie asked.
I don't really know.
Who created the Scepter? Skulduggery asked. Oisin puffed out his chest.
The Scepter was created by the Ancients as a weapon to be used against their gods. For 1 year they toiled, out of sight and in darkness, so that the gods could not see what they were creating.
His chest deflated and he smiled.
That's a direct quote from one of the first texts we found. I found it, actually. The others were so jealous. That's probably why they didn't want me to be the one to answer your questions.
Stephanie frowned. You're not supposed to be here?
We had a vote. I voted for me. No one else did. They're just jealous. They said I'd waste time, talk too much. So I stole the stone and went away for a few days to imprint it with my consciousness. They can't imprint anything over it, you see. And now here I am.
He beamed. Then his whole body faded, became suddenly transparent, and his beaming smile vanished.
Oh, time seems to be running out. If you have any more questions...
Who created the crystal? Skulduggery asked quickly.
Well, if you'll allow me to quote from the text that I discovered. The faceless ones created the crystal, and the crystal sang to the faceless ones when an enemy neared. But when the ancients approached, the crystal was silent, and it did not sing to the faceless ones, and the faceless ones did not know it was taken.
So their security system had a blind spot, Stephanie said.
It looks that way,
Oisin said, nodding. His image grew even fainter, and he held up a hand and gazed through it.
This is sort of unnerving.
The Scepter has returned, Skulduggery said. Oisin looked up.
What?
It was uncovered recently, then hidden again. We need to know how to find it.
Oh my,
Oisin said.
If the wrong sort of person takes possession of the Scepter...
It'll be bad, we know. Oisin, how do we find it? The old man vanished for a moment, then flickered back into sight.
I don't know, dear boy. Who hid it?
My uncle, Stephanie said. He realized it was too powerful for anyone to own.
A wise man, it seems. Of course, a truly wise man would return it to the place he found it. Failing that, somewhere similar.
Skulduggery straightened. Of course. A smile popped up on Oisin's face.
Have I helped you?
You have. I know where it is. Thank you, Oshin. Oshin nodded proudly.
I knew I could do this. I knew I could answer questions and not talk too much. That's what I told them right before they called for a vote. I said, listen, I can...
And he vanished, and the echo stone stopped glowing. Stephanie looked at Skulduggery. Well? Gordon followed the example of the last of the ancients and buried the scepter deep within the earth. It's in the caves. What caves? Beneath Gordon's land is a network of caves and tunnels stretching for miles in each direction. It's a death trap, even for the most powerful sorcerer. Why? There are creatures in those caves who feed off magic. It would be the safest place to hide the scepter. I should have thought of it sooner. Beneath Gordon's house, a world of magic and wonder Stephanie never knew was there. Bit by bit, she was seeing how close magic had been to her when she was growing up. If only she had known where to look. It was such a strange sensation. But what had Skulduggery told her when they were about to enter the sanctuary? Better get used to that feeling. Skulduggery closed his hand over the puzzle box, and the top slid over, hiding the echo stone once again. Maybe Oshin has more information, Stephanie said. How long does it take to recharge the stone? About a year. She blinked. Oh, well. Okay then, that's probably a little too long. Still, who knows what else he could help people with. I'm sure it'll be invaluable to, folks who are interested in history. Historians like... Actually, we can't tell anyone we were here. You could tell Ghastly. I'm sure he'd forgive the little trespass if you told him what we'd found. Not really. See, this is his family's chamber. It's a sacred thing. Us being here is inexcusable. What? You said this was just like a storage shed. You didn't say anything about it being sacred. Now you know why I have difficulty keeping friends. Skulduggery put the box back where he had found it. Stephanie was still staring at him. Is this disrespectful? She asked. Is this like dancing on someone's grave? A little worse than that, he admitted. It's like digging up that grave, taking out the body, rifling through its pockets, and then dancing on the whole thing. It's a little more than disrespectful. Then yes, she said as he walked over. I can see why you have difficulty keeping friends. Skulduggery waved his hand, and every candle in the chamber flickered out. They were plunged into darkness. Stephanie opened the door and peeked out. The corridor was long and silent and empty. She stepped out and Skulduggery followed, closing the door behind them. They crept along the corridor, up the stone steps, and out of the wood and iron door. They moved quickly through the gallery. The corners were the worst, as they were always expecting a vampire to round them just as they approached. They were nearing the main hall when Skulduggery held up his hand. Ahead of them, crouching in the middle of the corridor, was a vampire. Stephanie stopped breathing. Its back was to them, so they moved backwards, careful not to make a sound. They were just turning when Stephanie saw something out of the corner of her eye. She clutched Skulduggery's arm. The other vampire was approaching from the opposite direction. They sank behind a marble pillar, trapped. Across from them was an archway leading into another section of the gallery, but Stephanie was pretty sure that even if they made it through without being seen, they'd be cut off. Their only way out was back in the main hall with the harness, but their chances of making it without being torn to pieces were getting slimmer with every moment. Skulduggery had his powers, and he had his gun, but she knew he didn't hold out much hope that he'd be able to fend off one of those creatures, let alone two. He turned to her, hand raised, one finger pointing at her, then pointing at the ground. Stay. That finger pointing at himself, then pointing at the arch. Go. Stephanie's eyes widened, and she shook her head, but now that finger was pressed to his mouth. If he'd had lips, she knew his finger would be on them. She didn't want to. She didn't want to agree to this, but she knew she had no choice. Skulduggery took his gun from his jacket and passed it to her, and gave her a nod, and then immediately sprang up and lunged for the arch. The vampire approaching from behind saw him and broke into a run. The vampire up ahead turned and sprang off its haunches, and Stephanie shrank back as it passed the pillar and took off through the archway, joining the hunt for the intruder. The gun was surprisingly heavy in her hand as Stephanie crept out and started running for the main hall. Her footsteps echoed loudly in the dark corridors, but she didn't care. The only thing going through her mind was the fact that she needed to get out. She took each corner quickly, knowing the threat was behind her, and every time she took a corner, she let herself glance back. Empty corridor. Nothing coming for her. Not yet. She was approaching the main hall. Just a few more turns and she'd be there. She tucked the gun into her coat. She'd need both hands to strap herself into the harness. She turned the next corner and skidded to a stop. No, this couldn't be right. She looked up at the blank wall, her eyes wide. This couldn't be right. This wall should not have been here. She'd taken a wrong turn. She'd taken a wrong turn in this stupid gallery, and now she didn't know where she was. She was lost. She turned away from the dead end, wanting to scream at herself in frustration. She hurried back the way she had come, glancing through every arch and doorway she passed, looking for something she recognized. Everything looked the same in the gloom. Why weren't there any signs? Where were the signs? There was an intersecting corridor up ahead. Could that be it? Stephanie tried remembering their trail from the hall to the iron door and mentally reversing it. Had they turned at an intersecting corridor? She cursed herself for not paying attention, cursed herself for relying on Skulduggery to lead the way. They must have come from there. Every turn behind her seemed to lead to the dead end, so they must have come from there. She was 10 paces from the intersecting corridor when the vampire emerged from a small hall up ahead. It saw her instantly. She didn't even have time to duck down. The corridor was 10 paces away. The vampire was about 30 paces beyond that. She couldn't go back. If she went back, she'd be cut off. She had to go forward. She didn't have a choice. Stephanie bolted. The vampire kicked off and bounded towards her. It was going to cover the 30 paces faster than she would cover the 10. They ran straight at each other, and the vampire leapt. Stephanie dropped and slid beneath it, and she felt the rushing air as it passed overhead. She came out of the slide on her feet and twisted her body, then sprinted down the intersecting corridor. This was it. She recognized the statue. Only a few more turns. She heard the vampire behind her. Every corner she turned cost her precious moments, but the vampire just leapt to the outer wall and sprang diagonally to the wall beyond the corner. It was closing the distance between them. Stephanie burst through the doors to the main hall, and Skulduggery was there, launching himself at the vampire as it reached for her. They crashed backwards and tumbled.
Get out of here!
Skulduggery shouted, kicking the vampire away and scrambling to his feet. Stephanie grabbed the harness and hit the button. Her arms were almost jerked out of their sockets as the harness withdrew. She rose to the skylight too fast, and when the harness hit the top, she lost her grip. She managed to get one hand around the edge of the skylight as her body swung wildly. Her other hand clawed on, and she gritted her teeth and pulled herself up. Her head and shoulders emerged into the night air, and she hauled herself up the rest of the way to tumble out onto the roof. Fighting to catch her breath, she immediately went back to the skylight and looked down, just in time to see the vampire leap. She cried out and fell backwards as the vampire burst through the closed section of the skylight, showering her with glass. It hit the roof in a crouch. Stephanie didn't even have time to get to her feet before it dived at her. She turned away, and its claws raked across her coat, but didn't penetrate the material, although the impact slammed her to the roof again. The vampire overshot, but spun as soon as it landed, snarling. Its fangs dripped with saliva, and its eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, neither of them made a move. Then Stephanie slowly got to her hands and knees. The vampire hissed, but she didn't break eye contact. She tucked her feet beneath her and squatted. The vampire was waiting for her to make a sudden move. The gun was in her pocket, but she didn't go for it. Stephanie moved slowly. She kept her eyes open, didn't blink, didn't do anything that might give it an excuse to resume its attack. Her knees straightened, though she stayed bent over. She took her first step, to her left. The vampire moved with her. Its eyes blazed with sheer animal ferocity. All it wanted to do was rip her apart. All it wanted was her complete and utter annihilation. She forced herself to keep calm. "Easy, boy," she said softly, and the vampire snapped at the air. Its claws clicked against themselves. Even though they hadn't pierced her coat, her back was throbbing in pain. She knew that if it hadn't been for whatever material this coat was made from, that single swipe would have killed her. The vampire began moving towards her. Stephanie started to back away, but the moment she tried moving her foot behind her, the vampire's hackles rose. She froze. If it leapt from that distance, it would be on her before she knew what was happening. It kept coming, moving slowly, stalking its prey. The second skylight exploded, and then everything was happening too fast. The vampire broke its eye lock and lunged, but Stephanie was already moving, twisting to the side as the claws lacerated the space where she had just been. The other vampire was on the roof and closing in, and Stephanie sprinted for the edge of the building and she jumped. Her legs hit branches, and she flipped over and was crashing headlong into the tree and falling. She smacked from one branch to the next, each impact spinning her and making her cry out. She hit a branch with her ribs, and the breath rushed out of her, and still she fell. Then there were no more branches, and for a moment it was just her and the sound of rushing air. And then the ground slammed into her from behind. Stephanie lay on the grass, trying to breathe. She could see the tree. She could see the gallery. She could see the sky. Something was falling towards her. Two things, two figures dropping from the edge of the building. The vampires hit the ground and came at her. The window to her left shattered, and the security alarm pierced the night. Skulduggery landed in front of her. He thrust his hand out, and the air shimmered, and he caught one of the vampires, sending it hurtling back. The second one kept coming, and Skulduggery threw fire at it, but it leapt, cleared the flame, and landed with both feet on Skulduggery's chest. They went down, and Stephanie's body started obeying her again. She got up, still struggling to breathe. The vampire swiped, and Skulduggery's shirt parted, and he cried out in pain. Stephanie wrapped both arms around the vampire's neck and pulled back. It hissed and flailed, and Stephanie stumbled back to avoid its claws. Skulduggery sat up, and he pressed his hand against the vampire. The vampire shot backwards like it had been fired from a cannon. It hit the wall of the building with a sickening thwack and fell to the ground, and didn't get up. Stephanie grabbed Skulduggery's arm and dragged him to his feet, and they ran for the car. How are you? Stephanie shrugged and managed not to wince. Her entire body ached. I'm good, she lied. Skulduggery glanced at her as he drove. Are you hurt? Are you injured? No, just a bruise or two. I'm fine, really. You don't have to worry about me. Stephanie, you jumped off a building. Yes, but the branches broke my fall. Every one of them. And how were the branches? A lot unlike pillows. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. But you could have been. But I wasn't. I'm not denying that you make a good point, but the fact is you could have been. I've already lost a dear friend to all this, and I don't want that to happen again. She looked at him. Are you saying you'd be very upset if I died? Very is such a strong word. Well, if you teach me some magic, maybe I won't get hurt as bad next time. You said you weren't hurt. Are you kidding? I jumped off a building, of course I'm hurt. Stephanie. Yes, Skulduggery? You can be really annoying at times. I know. So, where are we going? We're going to at least find the doorway to the caves. Then we'll concentrate on finding the key to open it. Half an hour later, they were driving into Gordon's estate. Stephanie climbed stiffly out of the canary car and followed Skulduggery inside. The cellar was chilly and dark, and the single bulb hanging amid cobwebs wasn't doing its job very well. Countless years' worth of junk was collecting dust down here, and from somewhere in the dark corners came the occasional scuffle of rats. Stephanie wasn't scared of rats as a rule, but she wasn't too keen on them either, so she stayed away from the corners. Skulduggery had no such qualms. He examined the walls, scanning their surface as he moved sideways along them. Now and then he'd tap the wall, mutter to himself and move on. Is this the same as the way into the sanctuary? Stephanie asked. Are you looking for a secret passageway? You watch too many haunted house movies, he said. But are you looking for a secret passageway? Yes, he admitted, but that's just a coincidence. She pulled up the sleeve of her coat, revealing an ugly bruise on her arm, and covered it up again before Skulduggery glanced over. Did Gordon build the passage? She asked. No, it was included in the original designs. A few hundred years ago, this was a sorcerer's house. And he built a secret passageway to the caves. I thought you said the caves were a death trap for sorcerers. I did say that, yes. So why did he build himself a shortcut? Was he a stupid sorcerer? No, he just wasn't a very nice one. He used to drag his enemies down there and leave them to whatever creatures were hungriest.
What a charming history. I can see why my uncle bought the place.
Uh-huh. Stephanie moved closer. Skulduggery's hand was flat against the wall. He moved it and she could see a slight indentation, almost invisible to the naked eye.
That's the lock?
Yes. This is one of those good old-fashioned key-required locks. The kind a spell won't open, damn it.
Can you break it?
I could break it, but then it wouldn't work and we couldn't get the door open.
I meant break through it.
That would work if the door was in the same place as the lock, but things are rarely that straightforward.
So we need the key?
We need the key.
I don't suppose we'll find it on one of Gordon's key rings.
Indeed, this is not a regular key we're looking for.
We don't have to solve a puzzle to get it, do we?
We may. Stephanie groaned.
Oh, how come nothing's ever simple?
Every solution to every problem is simple. It's the distance between the two wherein the mystery lies. They turned off the light and climbed the stairs out of the dank mustiness of the cellar. They walked into the living room, and a man in a suit that looked almost Victorian in design, turned to them. He had black hair and thin lips, and his right hand, which was skinless, glistened with blood and wet muscle. And before Stephanie could even register surprise, Skulduggery was pulling the gun from his jacket. The man moved as gunshots filled the room, stepping to one side and waving his right hand. She didn't know what he did, but it worked, and no bullets hit him.
Run!
Skulduggery said, pushing her out of the room. She stumbled, and something moved beside her, and she turned as another man came at her. There was something wrong with him, something wrong with his skin, with his features. They didn't look real. They looked almost papery. She tried to hit it, but it was like hitting a bag of air. A fist swung at her, but unlike its body, the fist was heavy and solid, and it snapped her head back. She staggered, and it reached for her, but then Skulduggery was there, hurling it away. 3 more of them came through the front door. Stephanie ran to the stairs, Skulduggery covering her escape. Halfway up, she looked back as the man in the suit strolled into the hall. She shouted a warning, and Skulduggery turned to face him, but it was too late. Purple vapor gathered in the man's left palm, and he released it in a stream that flowed into Skulduggery and arced out behind him and above, flowing back into the man's other hand, forming a circle. Skulduggery dropped to his knees, tried to raise the gun, but couldn't hold it, and it fell to the floor.
Take him,
the man said, cutting off the purple stream. Skulduggery sagged, and 3 of the paper men grabbed him, started dragging him out of the house. The man motioned to the 4th.
You killed a girl.
And he walked out. Stephanie sprinted to the landing, the papery thing clumping up the stairs behind her. She ran to Gordon's dark study, slammed the door, and pushed over one of the bookcases. It toppled and crashed, and books spilled across the floor. The door opened a fraction and hit the bookcase. Heavy fists started to pound on it from the other side. She went to the window, opened it, and looked down. Even if she made the drop without breaking her legs, she'd land right in front of the man with the red hand. She backed off, looked around for a weapon. The bookcase slowly scraped across the floor. The door opened wider. Stephanie turned, moved behind the desk, and hid. The pounding continued. She peered out. She could see a papery arm now reaching around, then a shoulder, and a head. She ducked back into hiding. One last heave, and the door was open wide enough for the thing to step over the fallen bookcase. Stephanie stopped breathing. She peeked out. It crossed to the window and leaned out, hands on the sill. Stephanie rose and launched herself forward. It hurt her and tried to turn, but she slammed into it. Its heavy hands slipped off the windowsill and dragged it through, and Stephanie reached down, grabbed its lower leg and hauled. The thing tried to reach back through the window, but it was too late, and out it went with a faint rustle of paper. It landed in a heap, and she saw the man in the suit glare up at her. He waved his arm, and she threw herself away from the window as the air turned purple and the window exploded. Glass shards rained down on her back, but they didn't tear through the coat. She lay where she was, hands over her head, until she heard a car start up. Then she got up, glass and splinters of wood falling from her, and reached the window just in time to see the silver car leave the estate. They'd left her, obviously deciding it wasn't worth the effort to make sure she was dead. Stephanie pulled the crumpled business card from her pocket, got out her phone and dialed the number. The call was picked up almost immediately. She spoke urgently. "I need help. They've taken Skulduggery."
Tell me where you are,
China Sorrows said.
I'll send someone to pick you up.
China Sorrows was very still. She sat with her legs crossed, hands flat on the arms of the chair. The sounds of the city at night did not seep into her apartment. They were alone in here, the only two people left on the face of the earth. Stephanie watched her and waited. The apartment was vast, occupying the space across the hall from her library. Stephanie had leapt out of the car China had sent, run up the stairs, and had been directed in here by the man in the bow tie. No time had been lost. Skulduggery was in danger, and they needed to get him back now. China spoke at last.
How can you be sure it was Serpine?
What? Stephanie said, exasperated. Of course it was Serpine. Who else could it have been? A delicate shrug of delicate shoulders.
We have to be sure. That's all.
I am sure, okay? China looked at her, and Stephanie felt ashamed of her impatience. She lowered her eyes and closed her mouth. She was so sore. Her body was so sore. But it was all right now because she was safe, and China would know what to do. Everything would be okay. Stephanie would wait for her to make a decision no matter how long she deliberated, and she felt sure that Skulduggery would be safe and well. Even if he wasn't, what did it matter? China knew what was best, and if she wanted to wait, then Stephanie would be happy to wait with her. No, she said to herself, that's the spell. That's China's spell working on me. She dragged her eyes up, met China's gaze, and thought she saw a flicker of surprise.
What are you going to do?
Stephanie asked. China rose from the chair in one graceful movement.
I will see to it, she said. You should go home, dear. You look dreadful.
Stephanie felt herself blush.
I'd rather stay, she said. It could take some time before plans are in place. Wouldn't you be more comfortable in familiar surroundings?
Stephanie didn't like disagreeing with China, but she couldn't go home, not while Skulduggery was in trouble.
I'd rather stay,
she repeated softly.
Very well,
China said with a small smile.
I must leave, but I'll return when I have news. Can I come with you? I'm afraid not, child.
Stephanie nodded, hiding her disappointment. China left the building, accompanied by the man in the bow tie. Stephanie stayed in the apartment for a while, but despite the fact that it was almost 3 a.m, she couldn't relax. There was no TV, and the only book in a language she could understand was a leather-bound address book on a small table. She crossed the hall and stepped into the library. She passed a man in a porcelain mask, too engrossed in his reading to notice her. She walked slowly, reading the titles on the spines of the books, trying to keep her mind occupied. If she could find something here, a book that had what she needed, then maybe she wouldn't be so helpless next time she went up against Serpine, or anyone else. If she'd had even the slightest bit of power, she might have been able to help Skulduggery. Stephanie followed one shelf to its end, then chose another one, wandering deeper into the labyrinth. She couldn't work out the system. The books weren't arranged alphabetically or by author, or even by topic. It all seemed completely random.
You look lost.
She turned. The young woman who had addressed her slipped a book back into its place. She had tousled blonde hair, and she was pretty, but her eyes were hard, and she wore a sleeveless tunic that showed her strong arms. She spoke with an English accent.
I'm looking for a book,
Stephanie said, unsure.
This would seem to be the place for that. Are there any books here on magic? They're all books on magic,
the young woman replied.
I mean learning magic. I just need something. Anything. You have no one to teach you? Not yet. I don't know how to find anything in here.
For a moment, Stephanie felt like she was being studied. Finally, the young woman spoke again.
My name is Tanith Lowe. Oh, hi. I'm afraid I can't tell you my name. No offense. None taken. The books are arranged in terms of experience. These are far too advanced for someone without instruction. 2 rows over, you might find what you need.
Stephanie thanked her, and Tanith walked away, disappearing in the maze of shelves. Stephanie found the section she was referring to and started scanning the titles. An introductory guide to monster hunting. The sorcery doctrines. A history so far. 3 names. Stephanie took the 3 names book from the shelf and flicked through it. She came to the part on taken names, a chunk of the book that went on for roughly 200 pages, and scanned the headings in bold print. She turned pages, skimmed paragraphs, looking for anything that stood out. The best advice it had for taking a name was this: the name you take should fit you, define you, and already be known to you. She put the book back, unimpressed, and scanned a few more titles before she found it. Elemental Magic. She took it down, opened it, and started reading. This was it. This was what she was looking for. She found an old chair in one corner and sat, bringing her legs up under her. Her mobile phone was perched on the arm of the chair. Stephanie held one hand closed, trying to think of the space between her hand and the phone as a series of interlocking objects. Moving one would move another, which would move another, which would move the phone. She focused, opened her hand slowly, and then snapped open her palm, like she had seen Skulduggery do. Nothing happened. She made a fist, then tried again. The phone stayed where it was, just like it had done the previous 50 times she tried. "How's it going?" She looked up as Tanith Lowe approached. "You're starting off too big," Tanith said. "A phone's too heavy. A paperclip would be enough." "I don't have a paperclip," Stephanie said. Tanith took the book from her, opened it, and balanced it on the arm of the chair. "Use that," she said. Stephanie frowned. "But that's even heavier than the phone." "Not the book, just the page." "Oh," Stephanie said. She concentrated again, flexed her fingers and splayed her hand. The page didn't turn. Didn't even lift. "It takes time," Tanith said. "And patience." "I don't have time," Stephanie said bitterly. "And I've never had patience." Tanith shrugged. "There's always the possibility that you just can't do magic. It's one thing to know it exists, it's quite another to be able to do it yourself." "I suppose," Stephanie said. "That's some bruise you've got there." Stephanie glanced at her arm, to where her sleeve was pulled back. "I had a bit of trouble," she said. "So I see. Did you give as good as you got?" "Not really," Stephanie admitted. "But most of the bruising was done by a tree anyway, so I fought just about every type of opponent you could name," Tanith said. "But I've never been attacked by a tree. Well done." "Thank you." Tanith dug into her pocket and brought out a piece of yellow porous rock. "Run a bath. Let this dissolve. A few minutes in there, the bruises will be gone." Stephanie took the rock. "Thank you," she said, and Tanith shrugged. "I don't want to scare you, but this mightn't be the best time for someone to start learning magic. Bad things are happening." Stephanie didn't say anything. She didn't know anything about Tanith, and she didn't know how many sides there were in the coming conflict. She wasn't about to start trusting perfect strangers. "Thanks for the rock," she said. "Not a problem," Tanith responded. "Us warriors have to look out for one another." Stephanie saw movement through the stacks. The man in the bow tie was back, which meant China had returned. "I have to go," she said at once, getting up off the chair. She found China in the apartment, her back to Stephanie as she approached. "Have you told the elders?" Stephanie asked. "Word has been sent," China said without turning. "You sent word? That's it?" "Do not presume to question me, child." Stephanie glared at her. "I really wish you wouldn't call me child." China turned. "And I really wish you would pick a name so I wouldn't have to." "Why aren't we going to the rescue?" "Going to the rescue?" China said with a laugh. "On our horses, is that right? With bugles sounding and flags flying? You think that's how it works?" "Skulduggery has come to my rescue." "Well, they don't make them like him anymore, do they?" "Sending word isn't good enough. Meritorious has to be told. Tell him that we need Skulduggery to get the Scepter. Tell him that without Skulduggery, Serpine will destroy everything. Tell him whatever you want, but we have to make the elders act." "And then what?" "They call the cleavers to action. They call their allies together, and then we all go merrily along the war.
Child, you know nothing about war. You think it's big and it's loud and it's good versus evil. It's not. War is a delicate thing. It requires precision. It requires timing. We don't have time. Not so. Time is in short supply, but we still have it. So you're delaying. Why? I cannot have chaos erupting around me until I am prepared for it. I am a collector. I am an observer. I don't participate. My resources and my standing must be secure before I can allow the uncertainty of war to crash down upon us. And what about Skulduggery? While you're waiting for the right moment to tell everyone Serpine is the bad guy, Skulduggery might be killed.
The hesitation that flickered across China's face was barely noticeable.
There are casualties in every conflict.
Stephanie hated her. She turned and stormed back to the open door.
Where are you going?
China called after her.
I'm going to do what you're too scared to do yourself. No, you're not.
The door slammed shut before Stephanie reached it, and she spun around. China was walking towards her, her exquisite face perfectly calm.
You have no right,
China said softly,
to plunge us all into war. Who are you to decide when we fight? Why should you decide when we die? I just want to help my friend,
Stephanie said, taking a step back.
Skulduggery is not your friend.
She narrowed her eyes.
You don't know what you're talking about. And you don't know him, child. He has anger in him like you have never seen. He has hatred in him that you would never dream about. There is not one place he would rather be than where he is right now. You're crazy. He told you how he died then? Yes,
Stephanie said.
He was killed by one of Mevlon's men. Nefarian Serpine killed him, China said. He tortured him first, purely for fun. He ridiculed him, and he stripped him of his powers. And then he pointed at him. Did you know that's all it takes, with that red right hand of his, for him to point, and that it's all over?
Agonizing death, Skulduggery had said. Stephanie hadn't realized he had felt it himself. She shook her head defiantly.
That doesn't change anything. When he came back, he fought Mevlon's forces with a single-minded determination, not to defeat evil, but to have his revenge on Mevlon's lackey. Mevlon himself fell, but just as Skulduggery was in a position to claim his vengeance. There was the truce,
Stephanie said slowly.
And suddenly, his enemy was now a protected citizen. Skulduggery has been waiting a long time to get his revenge, and he will risk anyone and anything in order to get it.
Stephanie stood up straighter.
Even if you're right, that doesn't change the fact that he's been the only one investigating my uncle's murder, or that he seems to be the only one around here who cares about what is really going on, or that he has saved my life and put it at risk. Every good thing he has done for you has been cancelled out by every bad thing he has done to you. You don't owe him anything. I'm not going to abandon him. It is hardly your choice. What are you going to do?
Stephanie challenged.
I am simply going to ask you to do what I say. Then the answer is no. My dear Stephanie.
Stephanie froze. China looked at her.
I've known your name since before I met you, child. Your uncle spoke of you often.
Stephanie lunged for the door, but it was no use.
Stephanie,
China said softly. Stephanie's hands dropped to her sides, and she turned.
Tell no one of this.
Stephanie felt it inside her, and knew she would obey. Knew no matter how much she raged against it, she would obey. She had no choice, so she nodded as tears stung her eyes, and China smiled that beautiful smile of hers.